Jumpmaster Press is proud to present The Rise of Zhengyi by E.G.Rowley, Book 1 in the Brotherhood of Talons saga. Copyright 2023 Jumpmaster Press. Read by the author. And now, The Rise of Zhengyi. 1. Betrayal at Xiangung. Mud oozed through Li Cheng's toes, a sensation he disliked but tolerated to support his family. His mother, Tao Min, used to tell him the feeling would become as comfortable as laying down on his soft sleeping mat. It did not. For 8 years, since turning 11, Li Cheng worked alongside his parents and the other farmers of Xiangung village. Located within Xiangung province, Xiangung and the neighboring settlements produced significant quantities of rice for Governor Han Yijun's annual tribute to the emperor. The people of Xiangung, although looked down upon as a lower class of people, enjoyed relative peace and comfort as long as the rice continued to flow each growing season. Li Cheng's father, Li Huang, worked as a farming foreman responsible for the yields of several rice plots around Xiangung. Li Hao, Cheng's older brother, worked beside him, flooding, draining, and planting the thin green rice stalks. Like most young Chinese men, Li Cheng received a basic education centered around the family's collective occupation, farming. Eventually, Li Cheng and Li Hao might start their own families and carry on their father's legacy of rice cultivation. Beyond that, Cheng led a quiet, monotonous life, bent at the waist, shin-deep in brown water, with mud squeezing through his toes. "I'm catching you, little brother," Hao called. "I've got a longer row and you know it. Precision over speed, boys," their mother said, and dipped her hand in the water. She drove the seedling's thin root into the soft mud, allowing its long green leaves to hover over the water. She stepped backward and repeated the smooth, practiced motion with another rice stem. "It may not be a race, but I'm going to win," Hao crowed. Cheng picked up his pace and stabbed stalk after stalk into the water, splashing his rolled trouser leg. He shuffled backward and carelessly jabbed another rice seedling into the dirty water. "If I can feel the water rippling, you're moving too fast and not paying attention," Tao Min said. "Slow down, both of you." Hao sighed. "Yes, mother." He looked at his brother and mouthed, "I'm still going to win." "Your lines look loose, Hao," his father called from the side of the flooded rice field. "Check your spacing." "Yes, father," Hao called. Li Cheng snickered. "Cheng, pay attention." "Yes, father." "Keeping your boys in shape this morning?" Cao Guo said, and stepped beside Li Huang. "Yes, sir," Huang said and bowed. Cao Guo, the village leader, wore a pristine brown robe, tied at his waist with a gray belt, a sharp contrast to the farmer's drab blue and gray linen clothing. He carried a gold-colored fan and walked with a pridefully straight back. He wore his clean black hair in a long braid, frequently flipped over one shoulder. Guo often meandered among the rice fields, ensuring the season's productivity levels remained on schedule. The village leader reported directly to Han Yijun, and worked hard to avoid conflicts with, or even the attention of, the powerful provincial governor. "Good, good," Guo said. "We should have another good harvest this season." Li Huang nodded. "Indeed." Cao Guo tapped his fan against his leg. "Well done, all," he shouted. "Keep up the good work." Li Huang bowed when Cao Guo turned and set off for the next section of muddy fields. Although everyone in Xiangung lived under the same laws, Wu Xing, the 5 punishments for slaves, the village leader and his family acted above the others. Cao Guo's son, Cao Zumin, a young man near Li Cheng's age, also carried himself with an unwarranted aloofness. Cheng loathed Cao Guo's arrogance and smug attitude toward the people of Xiangung. He believed his father would make a more effective and even-handed village leader. Cheng dared not express his thoughts, fearing severe ramifications and the unavoidable attention of Cao Guo's politically connected wrath toward his entire family. So, for 8 years, Li Cheng, his mother, brother, and father worked the rice fields with the other villagers, under the ubiquitous pomposity of Cao Guo. Huang called to his family, "I'm going to survey the other fields. Boys, keep your rows tight." Tight and slow, little brother, Hao whispered. After their full day's work, the family retired to their thatched roof hut. Behind the house, the men bathed with large linen swatches dipped in warm water. Tao Min washed herself in the small kitchen area. When done, she built the fire larger, measured out their family's rice portion, and brought out 4 pottery bowls. She knelt at the end of a tasseled rug in the hut's central common room. In front of her, the boys knelt behind their bowls and freshly cleaned chopsticks. She unwrapped a steaming pot of white, puffy rice. The family smiled as the welcome smell wafted around them. Lian Zhihao passed through the village today, Li Huang said, and held out his bowl. With a large wooden spatula, his wife plopped a generous rice ball into the bowl. He looked to trade and had several salted fish. You have fish? Li Hao asked. His father pulled a small, wrapped bundle from his vest. Li Cheng licked his lips. Huang passed the bundle to Tao Min, who unwrapped it and smiled at the 2 golden fish. She tore one of them in half and placed it in her husband's bowl. The family watched Li Huang bow, lift the bowl, and deeply inhale. With precision, he plucked a bit of dry fish and a generous lump of sticky rice. He ate the mouthful and nodded to his family. Tao Min added a rice glob and fish chunk to the 3 remaining bowls, giving the fish's head to Li Hao in a sign of respect as the next oldest male. A knock on the door's hut startled them. Li Huang, open up! Huang placed his bowl on their eating mat, rose and answered the door. Outside stood 2 of Han Yijun's village guards, and Lang Jing, another senior member of the village. Jing carried a lantern hung on the end of a long pole. Li Huang bowed, and the 2 guards entered the house. Min put her bowl down and bowed. The guards, who often acted as the local constabulary, wore high-backed black helmets, matching robes, and leather armor. A brown belt hung at their waists, indicating their rank and position within Han Yijun's personal guard. Li Cheng, you will come with us, one guard demanded, and lightly tapped a cudgel against his leg. Cheng's mother looked up. Why must he go with you? The other guard looked at the food and scowled. He must answer for his crime. Li Huang stepped toward his family. What crime is that? Irritated, the first guard shouted. He will come with us, or you all will. Li Cheng stood and held a hand to his mother. I have done nothing, mother. I will go with them. The guards looked at each other and smiled. One stepped outside, while the other ushered the young man out the door. Li Huang, Tao Min, and Li Hao followed them outside, where the officer bound Li Cheng's hands with rope. It will be okay, Li Cheng said, before the guards walked him away from the hut. Lang Jing bowed. I do not know what this is about, only that Cao Guo ordered you to come as well. Li Huang bowed and followed several steps behind the guards and his bound son. The commotion brought onlookers from each house they passed. Concerned whispers trailed Li Huang, who offered each person a polite bow and a reassuring smile. The guards marched Li Cheng through the village to Xiangung's municipal building. Torches burned on either side of the building's main entrance, adding their soft orange glow to the evening's twilight. Cao Guo sat on an ornate chair just inside the doorway. To one side of the door stood Shi Jun, the village fishmonger, and beside him, Cao Zumin. The guard stopped Li Cheng at the steps leading to a stern-faced Cao Guo. Li Cheng, the village leader announced, a serious charge has been leveled against you. I have done nothing wrong, Cheng protested. Someone stole fish from me today, Shi Jun said and looked at Cao Zumin. This young man says he saw you do it. Li Huang stepped beside his son. Cao Zong, Li Huang respectfully said. My son is innocent. He has been with me in the fields the entire day. Cao Guo and Li Huang looked at Cao Zumin. I saw him, Zumin quietly answered. Li Cheng scowled. You lie! I took nothing. The family had fish and rice in their bowls, sir, a guard added. Li Huang turned to Cao Guo and bowed. I traded for 2 fish today. My son stole nothing. Cao Guo looked at his son and scratched his chin. Li Huang, your son has been accused, and this man now says he saw the evidence in your house. Are you trying to cover for your son's actions? No, sir. It is the truth. Find Lian Zihao, and he will corroborate that we bartered today for 2 dried fish. Cao Guo sighed. What you are doing is honorable, Li Huang. But we have evidence and an eyewitness. Your son saw nothing, Cheng shouted. He stole the fish. Cao Guo frowned and shook his head. Precisely what a guilty man would say. You betray your dishonor, boy. Li Huang fell to his knees. Cao Zong. Again he used the formal term. I request to speak to you alone. Of course, old friend, Guo said, stood, and walked into the municipal building. Li Huang stood and followed Guo into his private office. The village leader knelt behind a low desk and invited Huang to a mat opposite him. Huang bowed again and knelt on the mat. Sir, my son is no thief. The evidence says otherwise. On my honor, I traded for those fish from an old friend. Guo nodded. You said your son was with you all day. Was he with you when you made this trade? Li Huang huffed. No, sir. I left him with his mother and brother while I tended my other fields. It is there I ran into Lian Zihao. You sit before me, on your honor, then claim 2 different things? My son worked with my wife all day, as I'm sure your wife will support your son's story of innocence. Huang, Shi Jun has no reason to lie. My son likewise has no reason to lie. It is clear your son stole from Jun, while you were honorably seeing to your duties. I cannot accept that. Nevertheless, Jun will be compensated appropriately, and Li Cheng will be punished under the law. No, I beg you, spare Chang. I will take his place. Guo smiled. Mr. Li, you are a respected man and an asset to the village. How do I explain to Han Yijun that I spared your son and punished you? I will speak to Governor Han and explain, Huang pleaded. I'm sorry. This will be settled tonight. You and your family must accept your son's guilt. Huang looked at Guo and shook his head. I can't. Theft is a serious matter to the emperor. Wu Xing decrees Cheng be flogged and tattooed. No, he will bear this dishonor for the rest of his life. Please, I beg you. Cao Guo leaned forward and lowered his voice. You will accept Li Cheng's dishonor and the punishment according to the emperor's law, or your entire family will share his punishment. Neither of us wants to see your wife beaten for your son's crime. Sir, Huang whispered. We will put this unpleasantness behind us, Guo said, stood, and walked around his desk. Now, we will face this together, and if I sense any opposition, he paused. Well, I don't need to say anything further. Guo placed a hand on Huang's shoulder. After you. The pair returned to a growing crowd in the building's courtyard. Tao Min, Huo, and several other villagers gathered around Li Cheng, awaiting the village leader's final pronouncement. Huang joined his family with his head lowered and did not look at Chang. Father? Guo sat, pulled in a deep breath, and surveyed the crowd. With practiced ease, he softened his face to a thin smile. Li Huang and I have spoken. Guo gestured to Huang with a doigt de guerre. And as any honorable man would do, Huang asked for leniency and even offered to take his son's punishment. Huang kept his head lowered and did not look at his son. Tao Min gripped her husband's arm. We agreed on Li Cheng's guilt, Guo continued. What? Ming asked and looked up at Huang. I'm innocent, Cheng shouted. Quiet, the guard to his left yelled. He grabbed a knot of Cheng's hair and forced his head forward. Father? Guo quietly asked. Huang held out a hand to steady his family. Guo stood. We have an accusation, an eyewitness, and evidence of the crime. Huang has agreed to compensate Shi Jun. As for Li Cheng, we cannot allow thievery to go unpunished, and the law is the law. He looked at Chang. According to the emperor's law, Wu Xing, I sentence you to be flogged and marked. Your sentence will be carried out tomorrow at dawn." Tao Min wept. "No," Li Hao whispered. The crowd murmured. "Take him away," Guo ordered. The guards marched Li Cheng to a small building used as both the village police station and their personal living quarters. At irregular intervals, Governor Han Yijun rotated his men throughout the province to ensure they received regular time with their families and not grow too familiar with the villagers. Inside, 2 cots filled the main room, while an attached room served as the kitchen. Haphazardly affixed to the kitchen sat the village jail. Initially used to house village strays, the small wooden enclosure forced prisoners to endure hours of solitude without the ability to lie flat. The taller guard removed Cheng's restraints, bent him forward, and walked him through the small door. The guard rotated a flat metal latch into place, locking Li Cheng in the kennel. He turned to his companion. "Is the soup cold?" "I'll stoke the fire. Won't take a minute." The guards unburdened their armor and sat in the building's common room. They slurped their soups, talked of their homes, made off-color jokes, and reminisced about previous duty assignments. "Hey, thief," the older guard called to Li Cheng. "Was a fish worth a layer of your hide?" "I'm no thief," Cheng quietly replied. "That's not what it will say on your cheek tomorrow," Li Cheng fumed. He sat against the cage's wall with his knees pulled to his chest. His mind raced over the day's events, repeating every word, facial expression, and gesture. Why did my father accept this? Guo must have forced him. Why would Zumin lie? He must be the thief, Cheng whispered. His father is protecting him, he thought. He hit the cage's side wall with a balled fist. "Hey," a guard called. "Calm down in there, thief." The 2 guards finished their dinner, blew out their small lamps, and rolled onto their cots. "I'm up in 4 hours for night rounds," one said. His companion agreed, and silence settled over the small hut. Cheng did not sleep. Hours later, he heard the guard wake. Thin light shafts passed between the slats of his prison, dancing as the guard dressed and left the hut for his sentry rounds. Darkness again enveloped the cage. His back ached from the awkward position and his inability to stretch out. He shuffled in the wooden box, which caused the metal latch to rattle. A faint creaking sound wafted through the common room. Cheng held his breath to better hear the sound. Someone entering the building? Several loud thumps echoed through the hut, followed by a low moan and 2 additional thumps. Cheng sat forward. Footsteps approached the cage, and the latch rattled again. Li Cheng tensed. The footsteps quickly retreated, then faded, and Cheng heard the sound of someone running from the guard's shack. He moved to the cage door, pushed it open, and crawled to freedom. His joints cracked, and his muscles protested after sitting for hours in the dog kennel. Cheng moved to the common room, squinting in the darkness. He slipped and fell hard to the packed earth floor, sloshing in a warm liquid. A moan next to his ear startled him, and he scrambled away from the pathetic sound. Cheng crawled from the hut's doorway and rolled into pale moonlight. Reddish-black ooze covered his hands, knees, and trousers. He stood and looked toward Xiangung village's torchlight. Someone freed me. How, father? Cheng followed his initial instinct and ran into the forest. He longed to run home, to see his family, but his sore legs propelled him forward. His adrenaline-fueled heart beat like a drum and forced him to gulp air. Exhausted, he flopped near a bamboo grove and rubbed the guard's drying blood from his hands. Someone bludgeoned the guard to release me. Li Cheng looked back in the village's direction. Is he dead? No, Cheng whispered. He moaned when I fell. Thoughts crashed against each other like battling warships. Get up! Run! Am I responsible for that man's life? Get away! They're going to hunt me down. You can't let him die. Cheng stood and crept back to the guard's hut. Inside, he found the unconscious guard, alive. Blood dripped from several gashes in his forehead. Li Cheng tore strips from the vacant bunk and gently wrapped them around the guard's wounds. He dipped water from a basin in the common room's corner and drizzled it onto the man's lips. The guard's eyelids fluttered open, and his eyeballs rolled backward. "You're alive. I've patched your wounds," Cheng whispered. The man moaned, and in the pale light locked eyes with his former prisoner. Li Cheng smiled. "I can't stay with you. You'll be fine." He stood and turned to the hut's doorway. The silhouette of a sword-wielding man startled him. "What have you done?" Cheng stepped away from the guard and raised his hands. "Ping!" the guard shouted and moved to his companion's bunk. He kept himself between Li Cheng and the doorway with his sword raised. "I dressed his wounds." "Back in the cage!" the guard yelled and jabbed his sword at Li Cheng. Cheng walked backward. His eyes darted from the advancing guard and the hut's doorway. "I didn't hurt him." "In the cage!" The sword sliced through the air. Li Cheng bumped the small cage, bent, and ducked inside. The guard slammed the door closed with the tip of his Xian sword. He flicked the metal latch closed and slid the thin sword through a gap in the cage's slats. Cheng slid backward. The guard wildly stabbed into the cage and shouted, "You're going to pay!" The blade jabbed Cheng's shoulder and repeatedly sliced across his arms. He howled as the Xian's blade slashed across the cage. Li Cheng danced away from the onslaught. "I saved him!" he shouted. The guard yelled with each sword thrust, stopping only when Lao Ping moaned behind him. The Xian slid from the cage, sending a pinging echo through the hut. Cheng tore strips from his linen shirt and tightly wrapped his cuts. He held a large wad to his shoulder and tore more strips to secure it in place. Every move shot blistering hot pain through him, which drove his anguish to new depths. "I should have run!" he screamed in his mind. Faint light grew in the doorway, and several people arrived at the guard's hut. "I don't know how he got out," the guard reported. From the sounds, another person entered the hut to examine guard Lao Ping. "The bleeding has stopped." "He fell on him while he slept." "There, my friend. I'm going to look under the bandages." Lao Ping moaned. This man took several blows to the head. The guard walked toward Li Cheng and kicked the cage. "From stealing fish to attacking provincial guards?" "I bandaged his wounds," Li Cheng said. "I did not attack him." "Quiet!" the guard shouted and kicked the cage again. "He is going to live," the physician said. "That is good news," Cao Guo said and entered the hut. "I'm ready to punish this animal, sir," the guard said and bowed. "How did he escape?" "I don't know, sir. I went for my midnight rounds, and when I returned I found him covered in Lao Ping's blood." "I came back to save him," Li Cheng said. Cao Guo walked across the main room. "How did you escape the cage?" "After this one left, someone entered the hut and hit the sleeping guard several times. They unlatched the cage and ran off." "Who? Your brother? Father?" "He got out of the cage himself, sir. Nobody would dare attack a provincial soldier." "I didn't see who it was," Cheng continued. "You're lying," the guard yelled. "I found you over Lao Ping's body with his blood on your hands." "I ran into the woods but came back to help him." "More lies," the guard yelled and kicked the cage again. "I can't believe anyone other than your family would try to rescue you, but even they would not attack a sleeping man." Li Cheng slid to the front of the cage and peered through its narrow slats. "I did not steal the fish. I did not escape this cage. And I did not attack the guard." Cao Guo shook his head. "I don't believe you." Li Cheng hit the cage door and flopped against the back wall. "I have dispatched a messenger to Han Yijun and informed him of this incident. What you have done will bring a high price, Li Cheng. I can't imagine the shame you have brought to your family." "I've done nothing." Cao Guo turned to the guard. "If he comes, it will take several days for Governor Han to arrive. No one sees the prisoner until you bring him before Yijun." The guard bowed. "Yes, sir." Guo shook his head and left the hut. 4 days later, leading a large contingent of soldiers, Governor Han Yijun arrived in Xiangung. He rode atop a massive horse with his golden robes laced behind him. An ornamental sword hung on his left. He rode to Xiangung's central square and stopped his horse in front of the municipal building. "Guo!" Cao Guo stepped through the doorway and bowed. "Welcome back to Xiangung, Governor." A handler ran to grab Yi Jun's horse while the nobleman dismounted. "Where is my soldier?" "Lao Ping is resting comfortably and has received the best care we have, sir." "He remains alive?" Yi Jun asked. "Yes." "What of his attacker's family?" "I have spoken to his father, and I assure you they were not involved, nor had any knowledge of his actions." Yi Jun huffed. "Very well. I want this wretch brought here immediately, and I want the entire village to see him." "As you wish." Cao Guo nodded to a waiting attendant who ran to the guard hut and relayed the order. Moments later, guards dragged Li Cheng through the crowd. A wooden branch stretched across his shoulders, with his wrists and arms bound to its length. The prisoner's head bobbed with each labored step. His long black hair hung loose in front of him, matted and dirty. Dried, bloody blotches covered his tattered clothing. Tao Min cried at the sight of her son, and Li Huang gripped her shoulders. Hao scowled and hit his thighs in rhythm to Li Cheng's steps. The guard led Cheng to Qiangong's central courtyard and secured him to a large post jutting from the ground. Like a crucified man, Li Cheng hung limp from the crossbar. Provincial Governor Han Yijun, who sat for the gruesome procession, stood and walked to the edge of the municipal building's porch. 2 menacing soldiers flanked him, their armor and weapons glistening in the morning sunlight. Han Yijun looked from one edge of the crowd to the other. "This is a sad day for Xiangung. When word came to me that one of my men was brutally attacked, I could not believe it happened among the good people of this village." "I attacked no one," Li Cheng said, his voice low and broken. Han Yijun ignored the prisoner. "Cao Guo assures me that none of you knew of this man's actions. He and I know Xiangung to be an honorable village. And once I have done nothing," Cheng shouted over the governor, raised his head and glared at the man. "Nothing! Your village has turned its back on you, and your own family denounce your actions." "I am innocent." "Gag him! I can't listen to more of his lies," Yi Jun shouted. A guard stepped to Li Cheng and forced a knotted rope in his mouth. Tao Min shook. "Father?" Hao asked. "Why do we stand here?" "What can we do other than join him?" The guard wrapped the rope around Cheng's head and tied a thick knot. Li Cheng shifted his stare to Cao Guo, who stood several paces behind Governor Han. The governor continued. "Li Cheng, your back will be scarred for the thief you are. Your face will be marked to warn people to stay away from you. For your attack on my men, I sentence you to hard labor for the rest of your life. Lao Ping clinging to life is the only reason you draw breath." A guard walked to the prisoner, turned him against the post, and removed the remnants of his shirt. Li Cheng rocked from side to side, kicked his legs, and twisted against the ropes binding him to the post. The guard picked up a 5-foot length of flexible reed and waited for the governor's command. Han Yijun calmly returned to his seat and nodded. 2. The Mines of Fushan. Li Cheng's bladder woke him in the middle of his short sleep period. He rolled to his side on his thatch mat and opened his eyes. A single yellow enclosed lantern burned in the corner of the immense cavern. Around him, 58 prisoners rested. Some slept, but most drifted between desperation and despair while waiting for their next work shift. One or more of them would not wake to see the next shift in the Fushan coal mines. Cheng rolled to his knees, stood, and crept along a narrow walkway between thatched mats. Men snored, groaned, and made other more unpleasant noises, which echoed around the dark cavern. At the end of his row, Cheng turned left against the black stone wall. "Please, please," a man whispered. Cheng felt a pathetic tug on his worn pant leg. "Water," the croaking voice continued. Against the wall, a prisoner sat cross-legged in the darkness, a large kang locked around his neck. The man licked his dry lips and looked up when Cheng stopped. He squinted in the dark. A thin smile of recognition crossed the man's face. "Oh, Mr. Li, my friend. Please, water, please." When Cheng returned from the latrine, he stopped at a water basin near the cavern's entrance. The prisoner watched him with growing hope. His mouth worked in anticipation of the water on his lips. His hands gripped the edges of the large board hung over his shoulders. Li Cheng dipped a ladle of water and walked it back to the man, who opened his mouth like a newly hatched bird. Slowly, he poured water in the man's mouth, allowing the prisoner to swallow between greedy gulps. "Thank you, Cheng, thank you," the man said, and licked his lips. "You're a good man, Li Cheng." Cheng dismissively chuckled, poured the remaining water over the man's forehead, and wiped his face clean with a tattered sleeve. "And tell me," Cheng whispered, "what has being a good man ever gotten me?" "What a short-sighted outlook," a voice whispered behind him. Li Cheng turned toward the voice. An older man rose from his sleeping mat and stretched. The prisoner, with the large board around his neck, nodded several times, his attempt at bowing. "Master Bai," he greeted. "You are a good man, Mr. Li. Better than most in this awful place." Cheng instinctively turned his tattoo away. "There is no need to hide your face in this place." Master Bai turned and surveyed the sleeping men. "Many won't be counted among the living tomorrow." The old man walked past Li Cheng, making his own way to the latrine. Next to the water barrel, he turned back to the two prisoners. "This place is not the end for men like us." Li Cheng walked back to his sleeping mat, but sleep eluded him. He stared at the cavern's endless blackness and imagined stars overhead. This place is not the end for men like us. When the guards woke the men in Cheng's cavern the next morning, he and Jian Bai both counted among the living. In the line to receive their morning rice portion, Jian Bai lifted his wooden bowl to the young man in recognition. Li Cheng nodded. After their morning meal, both men ventured deep into the mine to their assigned work areas and picked away at the valuable black rock. Used for heating and cooking by those who could afford it, the polished black stone also made valuable jewelry pieces as well as sculptures. Coal sculptures adorned the imperial palaces and the houses of the country's wealthy elite. Lower quality or smaller chunks brought meager profits at markets throughout the countryside. Li Cheng pounded lumps away from the coal seam with quickly blunting iron spikes and single-handed hammers. Prisoners behind him scooped up the loose chunks, loaded them into reed baskets, and hoisted them on their backs for the walk to the sorting room. Prisoners rotated jobs based on the guards' whims. Cheng's only opportunity to sit with Jian Bai came each night in the sleeping chamber. For hours he sat with the old man and talked about philosophy, politics, and the world outside Fushan. In every conversation, Jian Bai sounded like a man full of hope, whose impending release from this prison was always the next day. The old man treated Li Cheng like a student. Over time, Cheng grew fond of Jian Bai and saw him as a teacher. "Tell me, Cheng, how did you come by the mark on your face?" Jian Bai asked after months of nightly meetings. Li Cheng felt the question's weight and knew it came from a place of understanding, not curiosity. "I was wrongfully accused and found guilty by the leader of my village." Jian Bai nodded. "Wrongfully?" Li Cheng looked at the floor. "I protested my innocence, but they did not listen." "And the scars on your back?" "Those were for trying to escape. Something else I did not do." "So you were lashed for not escaping, and marked for not stealing?" Li Cheng calmed his breathing. "That is correct." "And still you were sent here?" "A guard was injured." "Did you injure this man?" "No." Bai closed his eyes and stroked his beard. "You must have powerful enemies." "I did not know I had enemies." The old man smiled. "We all have enemies. My enemies sought to kill me, but the Emperor spared me and sent me here to die," Cheng commented. "Perhaps.
or he sent me here to protect me. His court is a den of snakes. I stepped on one's tail, and it struck me."
Li Cheng liked how the old man talked and enjoyed the nightly lessons. Over time, he found fewer run-ins with the guards and avoided their overly harsh punishments. The young man learned to find his inner balance, his dark and light. Each morning the pair parted to dig the black rock. Li Cheng used these work periods to reflect on Xianbai's lessons and positivity. Over time, Cheng stopped seeing Fushan as a death sentence and started seeking each day's opportunities. "This is an unfortunate season in our lives, young man, but it is not the final season. A man who cannot tolerate small misfortunes can never accomplish great things." The punishing work grew easier as his mind and body reshaped themselves. Where others withered in the darkness, Li Cheng grew. His mind worked through the intricacies of his situation, and his body toned itself from the work. Although borderline malnourished, Cheng's frame bore his weight with taut muscles and strong bones. All the while his mind opened, and his thoughts traveled beyond the dark tunnels of Fushan. Before long, dreams of a life after the mines entered his thoughts. One morning when Li Cheng lined up with his fellow prisoners for inspection, a guard pointed him out among the prisoners. "You thief!" the guard captain shouted. "Come here." Cheng stepped forward and shuffled to the overbearing man. Cheng kept his head lowered, knowing eye contact resulted in swift and ruthless punishment. Guard Captain Fang sized Cheng up and shook his head. He turned to his lieutenant. "We haven't had trouble from this one in a while." He turned back to Li Cheng and dismissively said, "He'll do." "Over there," the lieutenant ordered, and pointed to the cave's opening. Li Cheng stood next to two other prisoners chosen from other work groups. When a fourth man joined them, the guards ushered them from the communal cavern. Cheng looked back. Xianbai smiled and nodded before the guards hurried the men through an adjacent tunnel. Unbound, the prisoners shuffled their feet and kept their heads lowered while the guards steadily marched them through the dark tunnels. The group rounded a rock passage, and a distant point of light appeared. "We're going out," one of the men whispered. "Quiet," the guard shouted, and rapped the man on the shoulder with his baton. The opening grew larger, and with each step Li Cheng's heart pounded with anticipation of fresh air and open sky. "How long has it been?" he wondered. The work gang squinted and covered their eyes when they emerged from the cave's mouth and into a brilliantly clear day. Li Cheng closed his eyes and allowed the sunlight to flow over him. He pulled in a deep breath and slowed his feet. "Keep moving," the guard shouted, and pushed the men toward a caravan of waiting carts. Li Cheng eyed the forest surrounding the mine's entrance. The thought of breaking into a sprint flashed through his mind. The prisoner beside him also stared into the wood's shadowy crevices and licked his lips at the possibility of escape. His eyes flicked from the guards to the wood line and back to the guards, who intently watched the dirty men, eager for one of them to make their break for freedom. Coal bundles loaded each cart to its limit, with thick ropes straining to secure the tall stacks. The baton-wielding guards hustled the prisoners into the last cart in the parade, a cage made from flat metal slats. At each connection, a thick, round-head rivet protruded from the black metal. The door shut behind the men, and the guard captain paced around the cage, delivering instructions. "Don't get comfortable, maggots. You'll be back into the pits before you know it. And perish any thoughts of bolting, how dogs are kept hungry for those of you who think yourselves runners. Many a time we've left here with 4 and returned with less. Do what you're told, and things will go easy." The guard captain rounded the cart and pointed with his baton. "These deliveries need to be made, and you will unload the carts at each stop. When not working, you will be in here. You will eat, sleep," he laughed, "and do everything else in this cage. Any deviation from that will result in punishment." He tapped his baton on the cage several times and eyed each prisoner. "Xian, move them out," he shouted. More than a dozen armed soldiers bearing the imperial standard patrolled the coal carts on horseback. The drivers cracked their whips, and the oxen pairs yoked to the carts tugged their loads forward. The cage cart, pulled by a single stinking animal, rumbled forward. Each prisoner took a corner and jostled along the rutty road leading away from the mine. A small town had grown around the mine since Li Cheng entered the dark world beneath their cart's wheels. Bars, blacksmiths, and brothels lined the road, tempting the guards to spend their wages within. "It's good to feel the sun again," one of the prisoners said. Another nodded and sobbed. "I never thought I'd see the sky." "I don't know that I can go back," the third whispered. Li Cheng looked at each man. None appeared fit enough to survive more than a few hours outside the confines of the cage's bars. He crossed his legs, folded his hands in his lap, closed his eyes, and meditated on Bai's teaching. "Be mindful of the world, Li Cheng. Although you move through the world moves through you as well." A smile crossed Cheng's face. He liked the idea of the world moving around him, like stream water moving around a stone. "I'm a stone in the river," he thought. A sense of calm ran through his body, and instead of rocking against the cart's movements, Li Cheng sank into the motion and sought balance with the bouncing and shifting road. The prisoners whispered while the carts rumbled along, sharing news from within the mines. "I am Fua," one of them said, and smiled. "Mong," another answered, and bowed from his sitting position. "Chang." "Lian." The caravan rolled to a stop at dusk. The guards and cart drivers erected canvas tents and set small fires between them. They unburdened their animals, allowing them to graze freely on any green tufts they happened upon. The prisoners remained within their cage, huddled in each corner. The guards passed 4 small portions of rice through the bars, and each man retreated to their corner. They greedily scooped rice down to the last kernel into their mouths. "If you behave, there might be a bit of meat for each of you when we return to the mine," a guard said. Li Cheng doubted the prospect of anything other than rice if the prisoners remained well behaved. During his time at Fushan, the promise of better treatment typically resulted in ever harsher penalties for more minor infractions. As long as the coal seams ran through the earth, the prisoners toiled to bring it to the surface. A cool wind blew in overnight, and clouds rolled in before sunrise. The caravan drivers dropped their tents, harnessed their animals, and readied for their day on the road. They reached an imperial garrison just before midday. The guards hustled the prisoners from their cage to the first coal cart, where they untied the ropes and hoisted the hulking coal sacks on their shoulders. "Follow this man," the guard ordered, and pointed to one of the garrison soldiers. The prisoners carried the coal sacks into the garrison storehouse and piled them in square, chest-high stacks. The back-breaking work took several hours to unload the cart. Several of the imperial soldiers joined the men from Fushan to insult and jeer the prisoners. "Pick it up, old man," one shouted. "Those bags won't unload themselves, boy," another yelled, and jabbed at Li Cheng's legs with his pike's blunt end. The jibes brought laughter and increased hostility from the other guards. When the first cart sat empty, the Fushan guards herded the 4 tired prisoners into their cage and locked the door behind them. "Can we get water?" Meng asked. "Shut up, worm!" the guard shouted, and pushed his club through the bars. The panting prisoners moved to their corners and readied themselves for the evening's departure. That night the caravan stopped and repeated the events of the previous night. They ate their rice and curled up for a restless night's sleep. The clouds grew thick overnight, and a soft rain fell by morning. Like eager fledglings, mouths agape, the caged men caught what water they could through the bars. Although refreshing, the rain turned the cage's floor into a soupy mess of hay and filth. The caravan spent another day on the road before stopping to unload the second coal-laden cart. This time the wagon stopped in the central square of a medium-sized village. Open stalls faced the courtyard, and within each sat a craftsman, chiseling, scraping, and polishing black coal lumps. "Each hut gets 4 bags, the guard demanded, while unlatching the cage. The wet prisoners sloshed from the cage, loosened the ropes on the second cart, and hauled the soggy coal bags to the adjacent buildings. Low tables lined each hut's 4 walls, and behind each table sat a black-handed sculptor. A stacked pile of raw coal sat on the table's right end, and a parade of small black animal figurines lined its left. In the next hut, the artists crafted ringlets and bracelets from the soft black stone. Glistening black jewelry slowly emerged from each clump of coal worked by the artist's hands. Li Cheng hauled dripping sacks from the cart to the side of the work huts under the guard's watchful eyes. "What village is this?" Fua quietly asked after dropping a coal sack. The artist looked up from the lump he worked and shook his head. "You there!" a guard shouted. Fua lowered his head, turned, and quickly returned to the coal cart. "No talking!" The rain fell harder, and each sack of coal grew heavier until the 4 prisoners strained to carry them. They walked with their mouths open, hoping to catch a drink of water from the sky. The guards pushed them into almost a run, the coal sacks pounding on their shoulders with each step. "Faster! You move like an old woman! Let's go! Let's go!" When the cart emptied, the guards pushed the sopping, wet prisoners into their cage, and the caravan moved on toward their stopping point for the night. The guards passed soggy rice bowls through the metal slats, and each man worked to shelter himself from the relentless rain. The following morning, the coal train left the camping site and followed a winding road into the mountains. The ground rose and the oxen with each progressive uphill pull. The road narrowed as the caravan climbed higher into the mountains, following the deep river gorges. By late afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, and the breeze turned colder. No one in the caravan saw the ambush. The long wagon train moved along a narrow road cut into a deep hillside. On their right, a sheer cliff face rose high above them. To their left, the road slipped away down the hillside to a river gorge far below. Although scalable, the drop-off looked treacherous, and the drivers kept their oxen well away from the edge. Ahead of the first cart, a landslide blocked the road, and the driver pulled on his oxen's reins. Behind him, an accordion of carts slowed to a stop, which brought shouts from driver to driver. "Why are we stopping?" "The road is blocked." The caravan guards moved forward. "Why did you stop?" "Sir, trees are on the road." "You there, get those men to clear the road." A guard moved to the prisoner's cage and rattled his baton against the slats. "All right, let's get—" The guard's final word on earth dissipated in the cool evening air when a jagged gray boulder whistled into his face. The impact resulted in a wet, thumping sound like slapping mud. The bread loaf-sized stone crushed the man's nose, cheekbone, and left eye socket. Its momentum pulled him from the road head first, and he joined the rock on its journey to the bottom of the steep gorge. Shouted attacks rained down from the cliff above, followed by a torrent of timber, rocks, and dirt. Flowing like an avalanche, the debris slide slammed the emptied carts, tilting them precariously toward the steep drop. Oxen, men, and wagons washed over the edge when the tree trunks rammed them. The coal-laden carts remained on the road, the highwayman's valuable target. The caravan guards drew their swords and shouted orders, "Protect the coal!" Rubble peppered the prisoner's cage, forcing the men to cover their heads. The cart shuddered when a large tree slammed into the cowering driver, catapulting him from the wagon. The lone ox staggered when its reins, still in the driver's clenched hands, tugged the beast toward the precipice. The cart tilted to the left and carried over, tumbling down the rocky mountainside. The men rolled and bounced within the cage, their shouts muffled by the thunderous scraping, cracking, and splintering cacophony around them. Broken tree limbs shot through the cage bars like ballista bolts. Jagged rocks became razor-sharp projectiles, slicing and ripping the men's skin. The cage rolled like a tumbling dice, and the wagon splintered beneath it. The men's arms and legs snapped between the bars and the ground. The cage warped and flexed when each corner plowed into the hillside, snapping and bending the flat metal bars. The riveted connections between the slats failed and filled the air with a pinging, metal ripping sound. To his left, a metal slat, half as wide as Li Cheng's hand, snapped, and like a lance thrust by an enemy soldier, punctured his stomach. The slat's saw-tooth end ripped through him and into the prisoner sliding around behind him. Fua screamed and went limp against Li Cheng's back. The cage landed hard and forced the pair against the bars where the iron rivets held. Li Cheng shrieked and gripped the cold metal slat that ran clean through his stomach.
Hot red liquid oozed over his hands. The cage rolled, flipped once more in the air, and landed on its single remaining flat side. It slid to a grinding stop at the bottom of the ravine. Wood splinters, rocks, and the remnants of the empty carts showered the cage. Li Cheng rested against the bars, Fua's impaled body crushing into him. A fist-sized rock hit Li Cheng in the back of the head and drove his forehead against the iron bar. Debris and darkness swirled around him, sloshing over him like a wave. Li Cheng's world closed in and went dark. "I don't think anyone survived," a voice called. "Be sure, we can't leave anyone alive," another, more distant man shouted. Li Cheng opened his eyes to faint moonlight. The sound of rushing water nearly drowned the sound of a person rummaging among the wreckage. Faint torchlight danced around him, growing closer. "Wait," the first voice said. "I found one." A few feet from Chang, a man groaned. He heard a sword pulled from its scabbard and the faint sound of a person croaking. Footsteps approached the cage, and rubble shifted under the man's weight. A sword tapped against the cage's metal slats, sending vibrations through Li Cheng's midsection. The sword slid through the slats and into Fua's shoulder, deep enough for Cheng to feel the pressure on his back. The sword withdrew, and the man shouted up the hillside. "They're all dead." "All right, let's get this load out of here." The crunching footsteps retreated, and Li Cheng released his breath. Above him, he heard the faint cracking of whips and the slow grinding echo of wheels on stone. Cheng hung from the slat, his face inches from the cage's bars. His right hand gripped the metal protruding through his abdomen. He felt the ground with his knees and moved his legs. Sparks of intense pain erupted through his body. Fua's head lolled on Cheng's shoulder, and his dead weight pinned them to the bars. Cheng gritted his teeth and pushed with his left hand. Fua's corpse slid a few inches backward, freeing Cheng from the man's crushing weight. He pushed again. This time he slid his right hand along the metal slat, slowly moving away from the bars. Fire burned in his stomach. He pushed a third time, his left hand against the cage in front of him, and his right gripping the iron slat, pulling it from his midsection. Fua slid off the sheared end with a sloppy, grating sound. He thumped to the ground, landing on the other dead prisoners. Leaves and dirt covered the men, the cage a makeshift tomb. Cheng's blood left fresh streaks along the bar with each gut-wrenching push toward freedom. His blood soaked his pants and dripped on the corpses beneath him. He found footing on Lien's back and pushed again, adding a lunging step to his momentum. The saw-toothed, jagged end of the metal slat reached his back and grabbed more supple flesh, sending rivers of white-hot pain up his spine. Cheng breathed in short, choppy gulps, forcing himself not to scream with each inch. With a final push, the metal slat slid through him, and Li Cheng fell atop his fellow prisoners. Fresh blood flowed from the tears in his right side. He rolled to his side, tore shreds of clothing from the dead men around him, and wrapped his midsection with generous linen wads at the entry and exit wound. The bandages quickly soaked and turned brown with his blood. He inched, feet first, through a gash in the cage's bars, and half-submerged his feet into cool, rushing water. The current tugged his legs and pulled at his stomach wounds. Water penetrated the soaked bandages, and fresh jolts of stinging pain burst from his abdomen. Cheng reached for the safety of the bank, but his hands slipped on the wet rocks, and the river took him, the wreckage quickly fading from view. The water tossed him, dunked him, and slammed him against rocks while it swept him downstream. Cheng worked to keep his head above water and his feet in front of him to absorb impacts with incoming boulders. When not underwater, he scanned the bank for signs of safety. The world swirled around Cheng, but before long the river calmed and allowed him to paddle to shore. He pulled himself onto the loamy bank, panting. His body ached, and his makeshift bandages left a bloody trail from the water's edge. Finally, he collapsed and rolled to his back, his lower legs sloshing in the dark water. Cheng gasped for breath. stared into the star-filled sky, and wept until unconsciousness soothed him. 3. A Dream of Dragons. A disembodied voice whispered from the distant, dark corners of Li Cheng's mind. "I feel your life leaving." Cheng shook awake. Even at a whisper, the voice contained raw, thundering power. It felt heavy, oppressive, yet welcoming, as though spoken by a friend. Cheng opened his eyes to the twinkling of countless stars, which shook when the voice spoke again. "You are not long for your world." The voice, not only in his mind, rolled through Cheng's body like an earthquake. He tried to steady himself against it, sending the points of light above him into a dance as though reflecting from a rippling lake. Surprisingly, Cheng felt no physical pain when his body jerked against the voice. Instead, his mind overflowed with memories of his village, his conviction, and the torturous years in the mines. He writhed against the erupting mnemonic pain of each remembered lash. He felt the thieves' mark etched onto his cheek, which now throbbed in rhythm to his pounding heart. His blind hatred churned like molten rock rushing toward a volcano's summit. "The rage within you calls to me." "Who are you?" Li Cheng asked. His lips did not move, and he did not hear the question. He thought it. The voice continued, ignoring his question. "And your pain is a powerful beacon." A faint blue glow appeared in the distant star field. Its light did not flicker like the stars, but remained constant. "What is this place?" "This is the space between worlds." "I don't understand." The glow grew slowly closer, and Li Cheng made out the shape of an orb which swayed from side to side in a figure-8 pattern. "What's happening to me?" "You're dying," the voice replied. Cheng's body jerked anew, and fresh bolts of memory-induced pain rocked him. "I can't die!" The voice chuckled. "I assure you, you can." "No! They must pay for what they did to me!" "Ah." The voice held its note until a long breath followed. "Revenge is most powerful." "Not revenge!" Cheng shouted. "Justice!" A long, understanding sigh wafted through the blackness. "Justice is something I, too, seek, and is just as powerful." The blue orb continued its slow approach, and Li Cheng pondered its immense weight. The ball, many times his size, floated motionless above his chest. At its center, the blue orb's light reminded him of swirling mist. A hot, wet wind gust blew in his face with such force Cheng battled to exhale against the torrent. The blast pushed into his nose, and Cheng struggled to keep his mouth closed. The wind whistled past his ears. Cheng turned his head away and coughed, trapped beneath the orb and the racing hot air. The cough only opened his lungs, filling them with the orb's hot gas. It tasted like dirty water and smelled worse. Before Cheng's lungs burst from the pressure, the wind abated and the blue orb retreated. Li Cheng coughed the foulness from his lungs, gulped clean air, and watched the orb float above him. "Are you to usher me to my ancestors?" "I know not your ancestors, or the path to reach them. Your emotions beckoned me here. Your seething anger drew me to you. Your desire for revenge. What you claim as justice." Li Cheng sighed. "There will be no justice for me. As you say, I approach death." "Death comes for us all, but yours will not be tonight." The orb swished in front of Li Cheng and grew smaller, ultimately shrinking from his sight and joining the countless pinholes of light around him. "Now wake," the voice commanded. Li Cheng's eyes fluttered open to an inky black sky. He released a wheezing, ragged breath and licked cracked lips with a swollen, dry tongue. His entire right side throbbed, and pain rumbled through him with each haggard breath. Lake water lapped his feet, the slight motion sending their own reminders of his continued existence through his body. Cheng held his right hand against his stomach wound and groped for the water with his left. He cautiously grasped handfuls of muddy shore, slowly turning toward the water. Each stretch, tuck, and twist brought fresh slashes of pain, but the sensation ebbed quickly, feeling muted, dull. Cheng splashed into the lake. He submerged his face in the cool water, which stung his cracked lips, and sucked in an enormous gulp. Each gash flared and stung against the water, but even that pain felt merely annoying. A new sensation rose in Li Cheng's stomach: hunger. He took another large drink, scrambled ashore, and looked at the stars reflecting from the lake. He half expected a blue orb to fly at him from within them. "Thank you," he whispered into the night. "You're welcome," a deep voice softly replied. Cheng jumped to his knees and scanned the shoreline. "Who's there?" Laughter filled his head, so loud he cupped his hands over his ears. "Why can't I see you?" "Because I choose not to be seen." Li Cheng looked up and down the lakeside again. "Who are you?" "I am Pan Shi." "I don't understand," Cheng said. "You will," the voice announced. "How can I hear you but not see you?" "You are of a young kind, and limited in your thinking. My kind is old, and knows ways your kind does not." Cheng shook his head. "Normally, you would not hear me," Pan Shi continued, cutting off Cheng's comment. "But with the bonding, we can now hear each other in your world." "My world?" "I am going to show myself now." Cheng smiled. "Yes, I would very much like to." As though emerging from a dense fog, an immense white dragon slowly materialized before Li Cheng. It hovered over the lake and slinked its body in the air like a person treading water. At the end of the animal's blunt snout, long, thin strands of fine hair rippled from beside each nostril. Below that, a wide mouth, lined with gleaming white teeth larger than a man's hand, smiled at Li Cheng. Glistening white whiskers grew from the monster's chin and upper lip, and flowed with its movements as though the creature floated in water. Behind its scaly white eyebrows, spiked horns erupted from the dragon's head and branched to points. A long mane of brilliant white hair flowed around the dragon's face. The dragon shook its massive head and flicked its long scaled tail. Its slender body floated above the water, casting a rippling reflection. Pan Shi bobbed and snaked to hold its position in front of Li Cheng. Diamond-shaped scales ran the length of his body, shrinking in size to the tip of his tail. White triangular serrations ran along the dragon's undulating back. 2 short arms protruded from just behind the head, and 2 legs ended in sparkling white talons the length of Li Cheng's arm. Blazing blue eyes looked deep into Li Cheng. In its right claw, the dragon held a glimmering blue orb. Cheng shouted and cowered at the sight of the enormous beast. "Great dragon, don't kill me!" Pan Shi laughed. "You were near to death of your own accord. I have no desire to help you in those efforts. To the contrary, I feel much less agony from you." Cheng did feel better. "I'm hungry." With a powerful swish of his tail, Pan Shi flew off. The white dragon snaked through the air, quickly disappearing on the lake's far side. "Please don't go!" Li Cheng watched the dragon until it vanished. He stood on wobbly legs and groped along the shoreline. His stomach injury ached, but the previously intense pain of his impalement felt only a distant memory. The scratches and bruises on his arms no longer stung or itched and looked virtually healed. Li Cheng picked his way along the shoreline toward the rising sun, where the white dragon flew. I have food,
Pan Shi's voice said in Cheng's mind. Cheng stopped and scanned across the lake for the approaching dragon. Overhead, tree limbs snapped and a tan cow plummeted from the treetops. The cow slammed the ground in front of him, followed by a torrent of debris. Cheng jumped away from the carcass. "Are you trying to kill me?" Pan Shi appeared and slinked between the trees. He looked at the Kai with a bewildered expression.
"You said you needed food."
The dragon looked at the cow.
"Food?"
"I can't eat a cow," Cheng said. "And if I could, I would not eat it raw."
"What is raw?"
"Raw." Li Cheng looked at Pan Shi's huge face and repeated. "Raw, uncooked." The dragon flew to the cow and in one massive bite took the animal's back half in its mouth. The cow's head, neck, and front legs flopped to the ground. "It needs to be cooked," Li Cheng said.
"I don't understand. Cooked."
"With fire. Can you breathe fire on it?"
"I'm not that kind."
Li Cheng watched the dragon chomp his half of cow. A strange feeling erupted within him. He felt an almost uncontrollable desire to taste the meat. He imagined it in his mouth and sliding down his throat. He watched Pan Shi chew and desperately wanted to join in. His stomach growled and he licked his lips while eyeing the cow's welcoming red meat. Cheng's need for food turned into a burning desire to devour the rest of the cow. He felt as though he could take the animal in one bite. Without thinking, Cheng rushed forward, knelt next to the cow's exposed midsection, and plunged his hands into the animal's bloody flesh. He rolled its skin back, bit into it, and tore a large bite from the animal's shoulder. Cheng rolled his eyes at the burst of metallic flavor in his mouth and greedily chewed the morsel. Blood drained down his arms and smeared his face. His thoughts of the raw meat making him sick vanished when his belly felt instantly full. He tore several more bites from the cow and sat back, satisfied.
"I feel your satisfaction."
Pan Shi's voice echoed in Li Cheng's mind. He savored the kill and swallowed. "I didn't know," Cheng managed. Pan Shi gulped the remainder of the carcass and slithered it down his throat. Unlike the blood-smeared Kai, the dragon remained pristine, white and clean. Cheng walked to the lake and washed the cow's blood from his arms and face. He turned to the dragon.
"What did you do to me?" "We are bonded," Pan Shi said.
Cheng shook his head.
"It is common among my kind. When we meet a kindred, we bond with them. I have heard it works with your kind, although differently."
"You keep saying my kind and your kind. Do you mean dragons?" Pan Shi looked at Li Cheng.
"I don't know what is."
He sounded the word slowly.
"Dragons."
Cheng smiled. You're a dragon." Pan Shi laughed.
"I am my kind. You are your kind, Kai."
"What does that mean? I'm a human. Does that mean human?" The dragon shook his head.
"You are very strange indeed."
In the morning light, Li Cheng looked at his reflection in the lake. He turned to Pan Shi. "I need clothes and to cover this mark." He touched the thieves' scar on his face. "Then, I need to go to my village and find Cao Guo." He balled his hands to fists. Pan Shi swished his tail and flew closer. The dragon's eyebrows drew together, and his large blue eyes pierced through Li Cheng.
"I feel your rage. Between worlds you spoke of justice."
"Yes."
"What would you do with your justice?"
"Clear my name and bring down those who wronged me."
"And then what?"
Li Cheng did not immediately answer. He had not considered a life after his judgment in Xiangung village. He had expected to die in the Fushan mines, with his thoughts of vengeance dying with him. His gaze fell on the dragon's large eyes. "I don't know," he whispered.
"There's a village a few days' walk to the east. I will meet you there. The walk will give you time to think."
Cheng smiled. "Can't you carry me?"
Pan Shi vanished like evaporating incense. In his mind, Li Cheng heard Pan Shi's voice much softer. I have my own dreams of vengeance, Ulkai. Together, we will find justice. Instead of 2 days, the village, a cluster of farming huts nestled among tall hills, felt like a few hours' walk from the lake to Li Cheng. Physically, he felt better than he had in years, even before his conviction and imprisonment. Cheng barely felt the spot where the cage bar impaled him, and his minor injuries appeared fully healed. The bonding, he thought, and felt fit enough to run to the village. Along the way, he picked berries and worked recent events through his mind. In what felt like a few minutes, he went from condemned prisoner to the friend of a dragon. Was he Pan Shi's friend? Was this all still a dream? For a moment, Li Cheng allowed his mind to consume him, and he pictured himself dying at the bottom of the ravine, impaled to a rusty old cage. He awkwardly laughed himself back to reality and looked around the forest, overcome with the sudden feeling of being watched. He stopped and listened. Nothing. You have very strange visions, Pan Shi softly said within his mind. How long have you been here? Long enough to feel you doubting my existence. Pan Shi laughed, want to know if we are friends. Am I to have my every thought examined by you? It is part of the bonding, Ulkai. Why can't I see your thoughts then, dragon? Li Cheng slowly said this last word, sounding out each syllable. Because you have not learned to. In time we will share our thoughts, just as we share our speech. What else comes with this bonding? You have already felt the quickening, where you feel my strong emotions. Your body will also heal from most wounds within hours. I have heard rumors where our kinds have bonded, of your kind gaining our strength and longevity. I assume these things will come in time. And what do you get from bonding with me? Someone to do the things I can't. Like what? You are very close to the village, Pan Shi answered. Rather than press the dragon, Li Cheng focused on the approaching village. He dreaded the thought of entering a place where people would see his thieves' mark. Hoping most people would think him gravely wounded rather than a convicted thief, he removed the remnants of his blouse and tore a long strip from its hem. He wrapped the remaining shreds around his head, covering the mark on his cheek, and secured it with the thin strip. Cheng entered the village shirtless, dirty, and limping. Why he limped he did not know, but it added to the desired look of needing help. Are you all right, friend? A fat man walking next to a smelly ox asked, and eyed Cheng's long belly scar. I was. The man shouted toward the nearest hut and slowed his ox. Master Quan, come look! A graying elderly man emerged from the shack, regarded Li Cheng, and scowled at the ox handler. What's wrong with him? I think he's hurt. The old man shook his head and leaned against the doorpost. Then take him to Fang. The monk will know what to do with him. As though it was his idea, the ox handler grinned. Come with me, friend. We'll go to Fang. He'll know what to do. I don't want to. You may also, the old man called from his doorstep, want to alert Minister Zhu. If this is another victim of the bandits, he should be alerted. The man leading the ox nodded. Yes, Minister Zhu. Cheng continued, to be a burden, if I could just... Oh, no, friend. We can't let you go about in your state, can we? A hunched woman approached, carrying a half-empty burlap sack. She wore a conical thatched sun hat and a blue blouse. The man pulled his ox aside and allowed her to pass. He bowed and smiled. Mrs. Sun, he whispered. Mr. Kong, she replied without looking up at the large man. The woman stopped at the sight of Li Cheng. And what happened to you, young man? Li Cheng bowed. I fell down a ravine. My cart crashed and... He's hurt, Han blurted. The woman looked at Kong. Where are you taking him? Master Quan said I should take him to Feng Hua. The woman chuckled and shook her head. She turned and resumed shuffling along the path. "Come with me, young man. You don't look injured, are you?" Li Cheng looked over the ox at Han and smiled. "No, ma'am. Nothing that requires immediate attention." He fell into step behind the old woman. "Kong Han means well, but his ox has more brains about him." Mr. Kong shrugged and tugged on the ox's lead, content to go about his business, now freed from helping the shirtless man. "A good scrub and a meal would do you well, I'd imagine." Cheng bowed as they walked. "Thank you." The woman sized him up. "And I might have some old clothes. What are you called, young man?" Li Cheng's awkward pause caught Mrs. Sun's attention, and she slowed her pace. "Who?" Li Cheng said. He hated to lie to this kind woman, but also feared using his real name. "Hu Guan Yu." The woman laughed. "If you say so. I'm Sun Mai Wen." She eyed the young man, his head wrapped in dirty cloth. "If you're not injured, why is your head wrapped?" Cheng looked away. Sun sensed his unease. "Must be for the heat. It has been hot these past weeks." Li Cheng nodded and bowed again. Wen's hut sat beside a small farm lined with sticks at the corners. "Go around back while I heat water." She set the sack near the doorpost, removed her shoes, and slipped inside. Cheng walked between the garden and the house, through a low thatched fence. In Sun's back garden, he found a stone-lined washing pit among a stand of green bamboo. Several chickens scratched tasty morsels from the grounds, and a thin dog lounged in the bamboo's sparse shade. "It was my husband's idea. At first, I thought him trying to live above his station, but it is good for washing things and the occasional body wash." With both hands, she lugged a wooden well barrel. She tipped the water into the pit and smiled at Li Cheng. "In you go, Mr. Hu," she said before returning to the house. Li Cheng knelt and swished a hand through the water. "Don't worry, it will cool off," Sun called from the well. "1 hot bucket and 2 cold is what I like." The old woman made the trip to the well twice, while Li Cheng undressed and slipped into the hole. Bamboo leaves swirled as he knelt, bringing the water to above his stomach wound. "Use the river stone to help with the dirtiest parts," Sun called from the house. Li Cheng turned away from the house, unwrapped his head, and splashed warm water over his hair. He scrubbed his face and chest, using the smooth stone as instructed. Sun returned carrying a bundle of clothes. She stopped at the sight of Cheng's scarred back. "Oh my," she gasped. Cheng froze, facing away from the old woman. "What happened to you?" she softly asked. Cheng's shoulders slumped and his head fell. "I was punished for a crime I did not commit." Sun padded forward and left the clothes beside the bamboo. She averted her eyes and said nothing, silently second-guessing her generosity toward the young man. "And your story about falling into a ravine?" "The truth." "Clean yourself. I will make us food," she said, and turned to the house. "I like her." Pan Shi's voice rang out in Cheng's head, startling him. "She reminds me of an old friend." "She is kind," Cheng whispered, and scrubbed the river stone over his body. "I have no way of repaying her." He stood, dried himself, and donned the clean clothes. The brown robe fit his shoulders well, but the pants hung short, just below his knees. Around this, Cheng tied another, thinner, dark cloak. Although mended several times with discolored patches, the clothes felt good against his skin. He rolled his dirty rags into a wad and tucked them next to the hut's back steps. "This is Sun. I'm done," he called. The old woman's voice sang through the hut. "Who are you talking to?" Li Cheng turned as she approached the door. "Myself," he whispered. Sun stepped onto the porch and regarded the young man's back. "I have something to show you," Cheng said. "Do you now?" "And my wish," Cheng continued, interrupting her, "is that you do not turn me away because of it." She allowed a moment of silence to pass between them before saying, "Well, get on with it. I'm too old for surprises." Li Cheng turned, his head lowered in shame. "Your rice is getting cold," she said, turned, and walked back into the house. Cheng watched her disappear in the hut and slowly mounted the stairs. Inside, a clean mat held 2 bowls of rice and 2 empty teacups. Sun knelt at one end of the mat, watching him. He bowed low and met the old woman's eyes. She nodded and offered a hand to the place prepared opposite her. Cheng bowed again and slowly moved to kneel at his end of the mat. Sun smiled and kept her eyes on him without letting her gaze travel to the ugly black tattoo on his cheek. She filled Cheng's tea while he looked at the floor. After filling her own cup, she said, "We all have scars, young man. You more than most, it appears." Sun set the teapot beside her rice bowl and lifted her rice and chopsticks. She nodded to Cheng, who followed without lifting his face. Behind a mouthful of rice, Sun said, "My husband was killed by bandits on the road." Cheng looked up, and their eyes met. "I'm sorry," he whispered and regarded his new, clean clothes. Sun nodded. "It hasn't been easy without him, but I've managed fairly well on my own." Indeed. Cheng scooped the warm rice into his mouth. "I can't thank you enough for your generosity. How can I repay you?" "You can start by telling me your story." She laughed. "Not the one you told me on the road, Mr. Hu." She sarcastically said his name and offered him a wry grin. Cheng attempted to return her smile. "You got the shortest version I could think of without lying." Sun sipped her tea and listened to Cheng's recounting of his life to the point where he met her on the road. He did not outright tell her of his amazing dream, the dragon who spoke in his mind, or his miraculous healing. "I've heard of Fushan. You're the first person I know of to leave it. Your ancestors must be very powerful." She refilled his tea and cocked her head. "You said you were injured when the cart went over the cliff, but you don't look worse for wear today. How long ago did this happen?" Cheng's pulse quickened, and his eyes flicked around Sun's hut. She sipped her tea and studied the young man. "Bring her outside." Pan Shi's voice rang in his head. Cheng jerked and almost spilled the tea. "Can we go outside?" Sun tilted her head at the odd request. "What's out there?" "Answers, I hope." The old woman looked toward her back garden and nodded. She slowly rose and followed Cheng to the porch, where they both stopped and stared at the bathing pool. The water stood on end and formed a swirling pillar. It twisted around itself and formed a thick column that danced in the air like a snake standing on its tail. Sun's mouth dropped open. "Are you doing this?" Cheng smiled. "No, but I know who is." The old woman faced him. "I was mortally wounded when the cart went over the cliff, impaled by a metal bar. Here." Cheng lifted his shirt, turned the pink scar toward the light, and ran his fingers over the spot. "It went right through me." He turned back to the spiraling tower of water. "While I lay dying, I dreamed of a beautiful white dragon. He came to me and healed me." Cheng let his shirt fall. The spinning water slowed and sank back into the bathing hole. Cheng looked at Mai Wen. When I awoke, I found myself face to face with that which I had seen in my deathbed vision. Within a day, my injuries were almost completely healed, and I felt no more pain. The old woman released a nervous chuckle. "A fanciful story, young man." Li Cheng looked into the darkened sky and called, "Will you show yourself?" Pan Shi slowly appeared and hovered several feet above the pool. His white scales reflected the faint moonlight as he swam in the air. Mrs. Sun fell to her knees and put her face in her hands. Cheng moved next to her and cradled her while she sobbed. She gripped his shirt and buried her face into his chest. "Is he here to kill us? I dare not look." "This is why my kind prefers to be unseen." Pan Shi sounded fatigued. "No, dear, he saved me." Li Cheng looked at the dragon. "For what? I am still uncertain." Sun Mai Wen turned her face to the dragon and smiled. She studied his face and deep blue eyes. Moonlight tinted from his reflective scales, and the old woman fixed on the glimmering orb in his claws. Finally, she whispered, "I have never seen anything as beautiful as you, great dragon." When Pan Shi did not respond, Sun looked at Chang. "Does it speak?" The dragon huffed, and his voice thundered in Li Cheng's head. "It! He speaks to me, yes." Pan Shi flicked his tail and shot skyward, vanishing as he flew higher. Also, I would not refer to him as it. Sun watched the dragon disappear. "I meant no offense, great dragon. Forgive me," she called after him. "Will you not return?" Chang called in his mind. "She wishes to see you again." "She has seen enough. Stay with the Old One for a time. When you are ready." Pan Shi paused. "We have much work to do." 4. The Avenging Shadow. Li Cheng felt better each passing day. The bonding, as Pan Shi called it, filled Chang with more energy than he ever thought possible. He helped Sun Mai Wen around her cottage, but did not join her daily rounds throughout the village. He stayed mainly to the back of the house, clearing debris and filling the household void left by her husband's absence. The people of Zhengyi village regarded the old woman with respect due to her advanced age and the unfortunate circumstances of her husband's death. Mai Wen recounted the story of Dang Bo's death one night over dinner. "At the end of each season, Bo took a load of onions to Wukan. He returned several days later, his cart laden with goods he'd traded for. The people of Wukan are fair-minded and—" She waved around the hut. "Bo brought back some very nice things from Wukan." Mai Wen sipped her tea before cupping her small mug in both hands. "A traveling merchant found Bo's body on the side of the road outside of town." Li Cheng watched her. Recounting the story brought fresh emotions to the surface of her face. "And the authorities?" Wen looked at him through steam rising from her tea. "They know who did it." "And they've done nothing?" Sun shook her head. "They know of the bandits, but are powerless to do anything about it. I appealed to the governor, and he is just as useless." They sat quietly for a few minutes before Sun continued. "The worst part is I've seen Bo's cart in the village many times since." "The men who did it come here?" Sun nodded. "To trade what they've stolen along the road." Li Cheng's pulse quickened, and goose flesh rose on his arm. "The leader of the group, Dai Zhenya, visits Zhengyi regularly. I asked him once why they killed my husband." The old woman took another sip of warm tea. "They laughed at me and threw my husband's own possessions at me." "And nobody does anything?" Mai Wen shook her head. Li Cheng looked at the floor. "I'd like to go into the village with you." "Are you fully healed?" "I've been healed for days." "I doubt the people of Zhengyi would look past your mark." She offered him a soft smile. "I will find something to cover your face." The following morning, Sun Mai Wen surprised Li Cheng with a hand-sewn black cloth. The cloth secured around Cheng's neck and covered the tattoo, most of his mouth and his ear on that side. Sun stared at him, a memory flashing through her mind. She smiled. "Does it look okay?" Cheng asked. "It looks just fine, young man." Cheng spent most of the day with Mai Wen. He collected onions from her small field, watched her barter with local merchants, and explored the village. Few of the villagers paid attention to him, and the authorities appeared too preoccupied with their fantan, a gambling game, to notice Sun Mai Wen's new friend. Cheng learned the village layout, which stretched farther into the hills than he expected. Stepped terraces allowed the farmers to grow high into the hillsides. Cheng watched the village guards. Governor Yi Jun's soldiers dismissively carry out their assigned duties. "This village deserves better," Cheng thought. "This village or the old one?" Pan Shi asked in his mind. Li Cheng looked skyward and smiled. "Both." "Something up there?" Kong Han asked. He stopped beside Li Cheng and stared into the sky. "Oh, yes." Sun Mai Wen shook her head. She and Li Cheng left the hulking man standing in the village's common courtyard. After dinner and the cleaning, Li Cheng lay on his sleeping mat, staring at the underside of the hut's thatched roof. "Are you certain?" Pan Shi asked in his mind. "Yes," Cheng replied with a thought. "Very well. I will be with you. I know your power is within me, but I've only ever wrestled with my brother. The bonding will allow you to do many things. Also, in your world, I am able to control some of your elements." Cheng thought back to his mother's teaching about the elements. "Remember the days of the week, Chang?" A young Li Cheng smiled. "Huo, water. Shui, metal. Mu, earth. Tu." An overwhelming sadness flooded Li Cheng. He sat up on his elbows. "Pan Shi, memories of your mother triggered thoughts of mine." Li Cheng wanted to apologize for the painful memories, but before he thought it to the dragon, Pan Shi spoke in his mind, changing the subject. "I will go ahead and scout the roads. Find them. If they are on the road, I will see them." Chang waited until he heard Mai Wen's soft snore coming from her room. He dressed and wrapped his face in the head covering. He crept to the back porch, avoiding the second step and its loose, creaky board. Pan Shi flew high over the land. Invisible to humans, the dragon covered miles until he found their target, 3 men waiting by the road. Li Cheng secured Mr. Kong's ox and borrowed the big man's cart by the time Pan Shi swooped over Zhengyi village. "I found 3. Do I make a tempting target?" "Your animal looks nice and fat," Pan Shi said. "You may not eat Mr. Kong's ox." The dragon huffed, and thunder cracked over Li Cheng's head. He drove the oxen cart slowly along the road, trying to look like a merchant on the road later than intended. "Around the next turn," Pan Shi said. "They are moving toward the road." Li Cheng squinted in the moonlight and exaggerated his hunched shoulders. 2 of the bandits stepped into the road in front of the slow-moving cart. One brandished a stubby sword, and the other a club. "Whoa!" one of the bandits called, and stepped toward the ox. He grabbed the animal's yoke and looked at Li Cheng. The third of their bunch approached the cart from behind. "Where are you off to, old man?" Li Cheng did not answer. "Out a bit late, aren't we?" The club-wielding bandit moved along the cart's right side, past Cheng, and poked his club into the empty cart. "Hey," he called, "it's empty." "Use my power," Pan Shi said in Cheng's mind. Li Cheng stood, and the 3 men tensed. "Don't do anything you'll regret," Clubman called. Cheng stepped down from the cart. "Are you the leader?" "Stay back." Li Cheng marched toward the sword-wielding leader. The 2 bandits behind the cart ran forward and surrounded Cheng. His pulse raced, his chest heaved, and he felt Pan Shi's power flooding his body. The bandit raised his sword. Cheng feigned left and stepped right under the arcing sword attack. Cheng wrapped his left hand around the leader's torso, pinning the man's left arm to his side. Cheng reached around the man with his right arm, grasped his left wrist, lifted the man into the air, and squeezed the air from his lungs. The leader gasped for air and dropped the sword. His companions yelled at Li Cheng to release him and made threats with their clubs. Cheng released the nearly unconscious bandit, who flopped to the road. He advanced on the man to his right. The man wildly swung his club, one blow hitting Li Cheng's forearm. The bandit to Li Cheng's right stepped behind him and brought his club down on the back of Li Cheng's head. Cheng dropped to one knee, and another blow struck him across the shoulders. Cheng stood and drove into the bandit in front of him. He caught the man's club under his left arm after taking a hard strike to the ribs. The bandit screamed before Li Cheng squelched his yell with a tight grip around the man's neck. A club crashed down on Li Cheng's left shoulder. Cheng turned and thrust the choking bandit into his companion's next club blow. The strike caught the man in the forehead, and blood rushed from a long gash above his right eye. The remaining bandit yelled when he struck his partner in the head. He stepped back, out of breath. The man held his cudgel ready for the masked man's next attack. Li Cheng found the dragon's voice. "Return to your leader." Cheng let the bleeding bandit fall to the road. "Tell him I'm coming for him.
Who are you?
Justice.
The bandit backed away and looked at his partners.
They are coming with me. Go, before I decide to bring all 3 of you to the authorities.
The bandit bolted for the safety of the trees, dropping his club as he ran. Li Cheng lifted the 2 unconscious men into the back of the cart and turned the ox around and headed for Zhengyi village.
You handled that nicely,
Pan Shi said. I feel as though I could have taken more, but these 2 will suffice for tonight. Li Cheng walked the ox into the dark village, bound the bandits, and deposited the pair on the steps of the police building. He removed a dagger from one of their belts and affixed a note to the support post. Until you do your job, I will do it for you. These 2 are bandits that attacked a merchant on the road tonight. Deal with them appropriately. Zhengyi. Li Cheng returned Mr. Kong's ox and cart before sneaking back into Mrs. Sun's hut from the back garden. His ribs stung, and he suspected 1 or more broken. The blow to his head tore a small cut that quickly stopped bleeding. His bruised shoulders throbbed when he lay on his mat. Li Cheng closed his eyes and focused on his breath. Pan Shi's voice soon echoed in his mind.
You did well.
How did I do that? The dragon softly laughed.
We did it together.
I felt as though I saw their attacks before they happened. Cheng winced at the pain in his neck.
You did. Your natural survival instinct, coupled with my strength and vision, gives you an edge over any of your kind.
It felt good. I want to make them pay for what they've done to Sun My Wen.
There is much we can do together. Rest. You will be healed by morning,
the dragon said.
I followed the 3rd one to their lair. Tomorrow, we cut the head off the snake.
Cheng did not respond. Pan Shi's statement filled him with excitement and apprehension. Although he trusted Pan Shi, Cheng felt every inch of his injuries and doubted his wounds would heal by morning. When Sun My Wen shuffled into the common room the following morning, Cheng surprisingly felt well rested and pain-free. How did you sleep, young man? She asked when she caught him stretching and massaging his previously bruised shoulder. Well, and you? I dreamt of your dragon friend. He looked at the old woman while rolling his sleeping mat. Did you? She smiled. He is very handsome. Oh? The old woman blushed and turned away. Go wash. I'll prepare porridge for Zhao Xi. After the morning meal, they dressed and set off to Sun My Wen's small onion patch on the far side of Zhengyi village. A commotion in the village's common area slowed their progress. A man's voice shouted over the crowd. And I mean right now! The pair stopped beside Mr. Kong, who stopped at the back of a small crowd. What is this? My Wen asked. Tian Han Ying found 2 men out front of the municipal building this morning. The old woman looked up at the large man. Found? Were they dead? I don't think so. The big man shifted from side to side, working to get a better view. They look alive. Their hands are bound. Wen and Li Cheng pushed their way through the crowd, Cheng keeping his head down and his cheek away from prying eyes. 2 armor-wearing guards flanked the door to the municipal building, which also housed the local authorities. 2 men knelt between the guards, their heads down. Behind the guards stood Tian Han Ying, the village administrator, shaking a piece of paper to the crowd. Nobody? He looked over the crowd. We're going to find out who this person is. You don't take the law into your own hands. You hear me? Tian tapped one of the uniformed men on the shoulder and gestured to move the prisoners inside. He made a final menacing glare at the assembled, turned, and stormed into the municipal building. What was all that? Wen asked a woman standing beside her. Someone apprehended 2 bandits last night and dropped them off for Tian to find this morning. The woman giggled. The old fool is going on about vigilantes and how the law must be followed. Wen looked at Chang. Good on anyone who defends themselves, the woman continued before going about her morning's business. The crowd dispersed, and the 2 proceeded to Wen's onion patch. She eyed him throughout the day, but did not bring up her questions regarding the bandits. When the pair knelt at opposite ends of her common room's eating mat, Li Cheng expected the questions to begin. The old woman poured them both a steaming beaker of tea, scooped generous rice portions into their bowls, and generally ignored her house guest. Cheng eyed her throughout the quiet meal. Chopsticks tapped against wood bowls, sipping sounds filled the hut when they drank, and the odd cart rolled by on the gravel road. Still, Mai Wen ignored the proverbial elephant in the room. Before Li Cheng's heart burst from his chest, he set his teacup next to the rice bowl, placed his hands on the floor, and bowed low to Mai Wen. "Are you angry with me?" "Of course not, young man. I fear for you," she whispered. Cheng straightened. "I have only an idea of why you are on this path," she smiled. "But I must also remember there are two kinds of perfect people, those who are dead and those who have not been born yet." She sipped more tea. "You just do these things for your own reasons." Li Cheng bowed again. "We only seek justice for those who have it not." Mai Wen smiled and let out a long breath. "Then I must do no less." She stood and walked to a wood chest near the hut's entrance. She returned with a dark bundle in her arms and set the material next to Li Cheng. "Leave the washing for the morning," she said, and continued to her sleeping chamber. Beside Li Cheng sat a dark leather cloak neatly folded. "The old one cares for you," Pan Shi said in his mind. "And I her," Cheng whispered. Li Cheng stared at the ceiling, waiting for Mai Wen's deep breathing, his signal to move. He quietly dressed, pulled the cloth mask over his cheek, donned the thick cloak, and stepped into the back garden. He walked to the side of the hut and stopped at the sound of footsteps. An orange glow preceded two armed soldiers patrolling the edges of the village. Li Cheng knelt beside the hut, almost invisible in the dark hood. The pair walked to the intersection at the corner of Mai Wen's house and stopped. "Do you think something will happen again tonight?" one asked. The other shrugged and turned back toward the village common area. "If it does, we'll be ready." The first guard yawned and raised the lantern above their heads. "Here's to a long night." They chuckled and started their rounds back toward the village. "You will need a mount," Pan Shi said. Li Cheng moved in the shadows toward the stables, housing the local soldiers' horses. Unguarded, the mounts stood munching on tufts of dried grass. Cheng saddled one and led it, as quietly as possible, to the outskirts of the village. "The road is clear," the dragon said from high above. "They know I'm coming." Li Cheng smiled. "They don't know we are coming." He felt Pan Shi's approval. Well outside the village, Cheng spurred the horse to a gallop and followed the road by moonlight, his dragon vision lighting the road for him. "How far?" he asked Pan Shi in his mind. "You are close at the first river crossing." Unfamiliar with the road, but confident in his companion's coursing power, Cheng pressed the horse faster. The moon passed directly overhead when the horse rounded a corner and instinctively slowed at a small river fording. "Here," Pan Shi called. Li Cheng tugged the reins, dismounted, and allowed the horse to drink. He walked the animal to a small stand of dove trees and secured its lead. "Follow the river bank," the dragon ordered. Cheng left the road and ascended a sloping, wooded hillside, sure to keep the river to his right within sight. When the road disappeared among the trees behind him, Cheng found a well-worn path through the forest. "A sentry approaches," Pan Shi warned. Li Cheng knelt behind a thick trunk, focused his energy on Pan Shi, and allowed the man to pass. Cheng sprung from his hiding place and subdued the guard with a choking arm around the man's neck. He lay the unconscious sentry in some underbrush just off the path. "Two more ahead on either side of the opening." Cheng crept forward and surveyed the bandits' hideout, a narrow horizontal cave mouth in the hillside. A thin layer of covering rock extended over the opening, further obscuring the hole within the thick forest. The guards, each armed with a long pike, stood at opposite ends of the cave within eyesight of the other. Cheng looked at the moon. "I need more darkness, Panshi." A band of thick clouds formed overhead, blotted out the moon, and started a light rain. Cheng pulled the hood of his cloak low and stepped onto the path. The clouds parted, and the guards, noticing the man who appeared from nowhere, quickly moved toward him. "You there!" one of the guards called. "Stop!" Cheng strolled forward, his arms to his sides, palms open. Under his hood, Cheng's pulse raced as the dragon's energy flowed into him. The guard lowered his spear, reset his firm grip, and cautiously approached. His companion took position in the cave's mouth. "I said stop!" Cheng took a final step and waited for the guard to approach. When the tip of the spear came within arm's reach, Cheng's right hand shot forward, grasped the spear shaft, and pulled it to his side. The movement, like the strike of a venomous snake, caught the guard by surprise, and the man lurched forward. Cheng lunged with his left foot and drove the palm of his left hand into the guard, releasing Panshi's powerful dragon energy. The guard collapsed. The man's head and arms flopped forward from inertia, while his chest moved backward. His boots left the ground and trailed him as he flew to the cave mouth. The guard landed in a heap, slid to his companion's feet, and flopped sideways, twisted and contorted in an unconscious pile. The standing guard ran into the cave, sounded the alarm, and screamed for reinforcements at the cave mouth. Li Cheng walked to the middle of the road and waited. He took long, deep breaths, allowing Panshi's energy to flow through him and strengthen him. It felt like cold water flowing over him and raised goose flesh on his arms and neck. Within the cave, men approached the opening. Their leader, Zhengyi, stepped to the front of the small crowd. He pointed and laughed. "This is why you raised the alarm? I was expecting an army at our doorstep." Cheng channeled Panshi's voice, which echoed around the cave's opening. "Zhengyi, I am here to avenge the murder of Dang Bo." The outlaws looked at their leader. None dared ever call him out like this dark figure. Zhengyi studied the man standing in the rain. He turned and barked, "Shoot him!" Archers, stationed at the edges of the throng, drew their bows and took aim. Panshi's powerful hearing, gifted to Li Cheng, heard the ping of each bowstring and the arrow's whistling flight. Time slowed. Cheng watched each arrow's tip twist through the air toward him. He dipped his right shoulder below the first arrow, allowing its fletching to skim his right collarbone. Simultaneously, he twisted his body left, lifted his chin, and rolled his shoulders backward to allow the second bolt to slice past his chest and below his left arm. The third arrow found its target in his right hip. It drove several inches above his hip bone through flesh and muscle. "Kill this fool!" Zhengyi ordered. Several men rushed forward and surrounded Li Cheng. "Panshi, suppress the pain," the dragon commanded in his mind. "Kneel, I'm coming down." Cheng knelt in the mud. The outlaws tightened their circle, believing the cloaked figure subdued. A powerful wind circled Li Cheng, forcing the men to shield their faces. A vortex formed on the ground, swirling the rainwater like a cyclone. The bandits stopped their advance. Unseen by the highwaymen, Panshi's glistening white body circled over Li Cheng. The great dragon flicked his tail at one of the outlaws, catching him in the chest. One moment the man stood among his companions, his weapon ready to kill this intruder. The next, his screams faded into the woods, his body crumpling among the undergrowth. Panshi's tail found another target, launching the outlaw into the cave opening above his compatriots. The ground around Li Cheng settled when Panshi ascended. Cheng stood and faced the outlaw leader. Zhengyi stepped forward. "Did the old woman send you? How much is she paying you?" The bandits laughed at the insult. Li Cheng pointed at Zhengyi. "You're coming with me to face judgment." One of the men behind Li Cheng lunged forward with a long spear. Cheng heard the attack and stepped to the side. He caught the spear meant for his back and wrenched it forward with two powerful steps. The bandit lurched forward and lost grip of his weapon.
Cheng swung the spear over his head, turned, and bashed it against the side of the man's head. Another bandit cracked a club over Cheng's shoulders, driving him to one knee. Seeing the cloaked man go down, more rushed from the cave. They rained blows on the dark figure, some stabbing, others smashing him with sticks and clubs. "Fight!" Pan Shi screamed in his mind. Li Cheng kicked and punched his way to his feet, unleashing Pan Shi's strength. He disarmed his attackers with overwhelming punches, chops, and kicks. Dai Jinya encouraged his men. "Yes, get him! Get in there! He's only one man!" One of the attackers pulled Li Cheng's hood, revealing the cloth wrapped over half his face. Cheng turned, gripped the man's hand, and twisted until his forearm snapped. The man fell and cradled his broken arm. Bandits crawled away from the melee, while Li Cheng, stabbed, clubbed, and an arrow protruding from his hip, steadily marched toward the cave mouth and Dai Jinya. Blood streaked Li Cheng's leg and trickled from his fingertips. Red droplets trailed behind him in the muddy road. The bandit leader drew a sword and stepped into the rain to face his attacker. He held his sword in front of him and kept his distance from the unarmed assailant. Broken and bloody men littered the road and the cave's opening. "Who are you?" Jinya shouted. "I am Zhengyi," Li Cheng roared, "and I have come in the name of Dangbo." The two men circled one another. "Why?" "Because his widow and the people of Zhengyi deserve justice. They also deserve to be rid of you." The bandit spread his arms and smiled. "If not me, someone will take my place." "Then I will visit him too," Li Cheng said. Jinya lunged forward and slashed his sword in a downward arc meant for the side of the masked man's neck. Li Cheng pivoted on his left foot and twisted to his right. The blade flashed in front of him. At the end of his swing, Jinya rolled his wrist over and brought the sword swishing back across his body. Li Cheng allowed his momentum to continue into a full circle and ended up behind Jinya. He caught the bandit leader's arm mid-swing and drove a Huracan fist to the back of Jinya's wrist. The man's shriek drowned out the sounds of his bones cracking and the sword splashing to the road. Li Cheng brought a knife hand to the crook of Jinya's neck, and the outlaw leader crumpled. Li Cheng grabbed Jinya's left wrist and dragged the unconscious man away from the cave. After several steps, he stopped and turned back to the carnage. Again he channeled Pan Shi's dragon voice. "Spread the word. Zhengyi is coming for the unjust." He pulled his hood over his masked face, turned, and dragged Dai Jinya into the night.
5. The Spreading Wildfire. Wen's dream turned from a pleasant vision of her small farm plot bathed in bright sunlight to a star-filled night sky and a howling wind. In her mind she shivered against the instant blast of cold air. Anxiety brewed within her, and she instinctively stepped backward. "Do not fear," a familiar and powerful voice said in her mind. Wen felt strong hands grip her shoulders and gently pull her against a tall, firm body. Muscular arms wrapped around her and drew her into a sensual embrace. A smile crossed her face, and she melted to her dream lover's passionate touch. "I hope you would return," the old woman whispered. She enjoyed feeling his warm body pressing against hers and how his ice-blue scales glinted in the starlight. He turned her to face him. She loved looking into this man's powerful face and shocking blue eyes. Mai Wen enjoyed the dance of light off the white, semi-translucent scales ringing his eyes and forehead. Short, white hair flowed over pointed ears adorned with silver rings, which reflected his ice-blue horns. She longed to feel his lips against hers. Pan Shi felt her desire and pulled her into a long kiss. She absorbed his energy and wrapped her arms around his waist. When Mai Wen finally broke the kiss, she placed her cheek to his chest. Her pounding heart matched his own, and the two stood together as one.
It has been too long since I felt a man's soft touch. I want to stay here forever.
This is the dream world. None of us stay forever.
He pushed her to arm's length and lifted her chin.
We can only be together for a short time, and I cannot stay in one place too long.
Then I will go with you. I can't be without you.
What you feel are the emotions of a younger you, not the wisdom of the woman you truly are.
Pan Shi pointed to their feet, and Mai Wen followed his gaze. They stood on a shimmering floor of undulating silver, which reflected the dark sky above. Mai Wen felt a falling sensation before Pan Shi steadied her. The woman staring back at her from above looked strangely familiar, but not the face she saw in the brown rice fields.
Your younger self dreams with passionate emotion, Pan Shi said.
I am still that woman, Mai Wen whispered.
Pan Shi shook his head. None of us are our younger selves. Look again, this time with the wisdom of who you are.
Mai Wen looked again into the silver reflection, and the man who held her vanished.
Do you not see yourself?
Pan Shi asked in her mind. Mai Wen smiled. The recognizable sun-chapped face smiled back.
Yes, she whispered. And do you now see me?
Far below her feet, a huge white dragon spun in the air. She looked up into the darkness and saw nothing. Disoriented, Wen looked at her feet. She felt dizzy. The dragon flew below her, a shining blue orb in one paw. Playfully, Mai Wen asked,
I prefer this dream through the emotions of my youth.
The dragon dissipated like smoke, and her lover's arms wrapped around her again. She looked down, and her youthful, smiling face looked back.
This is better,
she whispered, and sank into him.
I need your help, Pan Shi said.
Anything for you.
Our friend needs you to wake.
A frown crossed the woman's face, and she whined. I don't want to leave you. She rested a hand on Pan Shi's muscular chest.
I'll be here when next you dream of me.
Is he dying?
No, but he is badly injured. I brought him as far as I could. You must bring him the rest of the way.
Wen sighed.
Very well.
Her eyes flickered open, and another sigh escaped her into the real world. Soft, pitiful moaning wafted through the house, coming from her back garden. Wen padded through the house and found Li Cheng sprawled on the deck.
Oh my,
the woman gasped. She rolled Li Cheng onto his back, avoiding the arrow protruding from his hip. She opened his shirt to numerous punctures and lacerations.
I'll be right back.
Sun Wen returned with an armful of rags and a bowl of clean water. She removed his cloak, outer shirt, and skillfully cleaned and bandaged each wound. Carefully she pulled the arrow, which thankfully only hit flesh, from his side and stemmed the bleeding. She rolled him to his stomach and tended to the gash on his scarred back. Once on his back again, Mai Wen went to the common room and pulled several herbs from her stores.
This won't taste pleasant, but it will help you heal.
She crushed a small ginger root into the bowl, added water, and poured it into his mouth. Li Cheng's eyes fluttered open. His eyeballs rolled around his skull until they fixed on Wen's face.
There you are, she said.
He mouthed several words which escaped his lips as a pitiful wheeze. She helped Li Cheng to his sleeping mat, removed his face mask, and lowered him to the floor. Li Cheng heard the old woman walk to her room, and following more than a few whispered words, Li Cheng's unconsciousness faded toward sleep.
Your bodies are fragile things,
Pan Shi said. Li Cheng opened his eyes and recognized the dream world inhabited by the white dragon. The great beast flew above him, an odd spectacle in the endless black star-filled sky. He felt no pain from his wounds and rose to his elbows. What happened?
I brought you to the old woman's house.
Where's the bandit leader?
I dropped him in the village.
Dropped?
I believe he survived.
Li Cheng looked at his hands.
You need training. You need one of your kind to teach you self-defense.
Li Cheng nodded.
There is another matter we need to discuss.
the dragon said, sounding pensive. Cheng looked into the dragon's deep blue eyes. "The woman," he whispered. "Are you alive?" Mai Wen called from her room. Li Cheng roused. "I am." She appeared in the common room and stood over him. "Your dragon is a miracle worker." Cheng groaned and rolled to his back. "He's not my dragon. If anything, I'm his human." "Careful," Wen said. "I pulled an arrow out of you last night." "I remember." He sat up. "The soreness is the worst part." The old woman laughed. "Wait till you're my age. You won't be out fighting evil every night." Li Cheng pulled on his shirt and knelt in front of her. "Thank you for last night." Wen blushed. "Your friend asked me to help. I would never refuse him." Cheng labored to his feet and took her arm. "I need to go to the village." "Checking on last night's handiwork?" "Something like that," Cheng replied. "I'll heat water, and after morning meal we can—" "I must go now," Li Cheng said, and turned for the door. "Very well," Wen moaned. "I'll come with you." The two left the house and walked toward the village common. Li Cheng's weakness slowed their normal pace, but when they approached the village, as the day before, a crowd gathered in front of the magistrate's office. "Whoever you are, you've been warned," Tian Han Ying shouted. "We will not allow this kind of behavior." "Who did the vigilante bring in last night?" Someone in the crowd yelled back. "Dai Xinya." Sun Wen put a hand to her mouth, and several villagers looked for her in the crowd. Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked for Li Cheng, expecting him to be standing next to her. He was not there. She turned her attention back to Tian Han Ying. "He deserves what he gets," another villager said. "And he will be punished for the crimes he's committed. But it is our job to keep the peace. We will not allow—" "But this vigilante did your job. Why is he not rewarded?" "Because he took the law into his—" "I think he's a hero," someone shouted, raising cheers from the gathered. Mai Wen moved through the crowd toward Tian Han Ying and the crumpled man at his feet. The magistrate raised his hands. "Now, people!" "Hero! Hero! Hero!" one man chanted, and others took up the cry. Wen stepped between people until she stood in the semicircular opening in front of Tian Han Ying. The crowd hushed when she slowly walked to where Dai Xinya lay. He looked battered and dirty. He cradled his right hand in a strip of cloth tied around his neck and craned his head when the small woman entered his peripheral vision. Sun Mai Wen stopped approaching when the monster turned his head. Tears left wet streaks down her weathered face. "You killed my husband," she mouthed. She cleared her dry throat and tried again. "You killed my husband." Her words left her as a whisper, which brought murmurs from the crowd. Tian Han Ying offered a smile and stepped forward. "You killed my husband!" Wen shouted. Her chest heaved, and her clenched fists beat her legs. Two guards moved to the bottom step. "And he will face judgment for that, I assure you," Han Ying said. Mrs. Sun glared at Tian Han Ying. Finally, she gathered what saliva she held in her parched mouth and spat at Dai Xinya's feet. She turned and marched through the villagers, who parted at her approach. She found Li Cheng standing in the yard in front of her late husband's bathing pool. She stood on the porch and watched him. He softly spoke with his head looking down and his shoulders slumped. After several heavy breaths, he nodded and turned to the house, startled to see her standing there. The sorrowful look on her face cut him more than the bandits' blades the night before. Her eyebrows rose to pleading points over tear-filled dark eyes. Her lip quivered as she fell to her knees. She clasped her hands in front of her and whispered, "Please, no." Li Cheng, desperate to control his own emotions, paced forward and whispered, "It is finished." "I beg you, stay," the woman pleaded. Pan Shi materialized behind Li Cheng and snaked through the air. Sun Wen's mouth opened in awe at the great creature and the loving look from his white face. Realization spread across her own face, her tears dried, and she offered the dragon a broad smile. She turned to Li Cheng. "Wait 1 moment," she said, touched his arm, and walked into the house. She returned with the dark cloak and a small wood box. She handed the cloak to Li Cheng, knelt, and set the box in front of her. She looked up at Pan Shi. "You too have brought me the justice I so long deserved. For that, great dragon, I am eternally grateful." She bowed low in respect to the majestic creature. After a moment she sat up and looked at Li Cheng. She reached forward and touched the thieves' tattoo on his cheek. "When Bo was killed, the outlaws took everything. When I confronted them, they mocked me and threw things at me. I was able to recover only one thing for my husband that day." She opened the box and removed a black and red opera mask. "It broke when Dai Jinya threw it at me. In desperation, I scooped it up and put it in this box to remember Bo." Red and black ink emblazoned the mask with a ghastly demonic image. A long, jagged edge ran the mask's length from the left of its chin, below the left eye, over the bridge of the wearer's nose, and ending at the upper right forehead. Mai Wen held the broken mask to Li Cheng. "I can't. Nonsense. I can think of no better purpose." She replaced the mask and slid the box to Li Cheng. He bowed again and accepted the offering. "Thank you. You brought justice to my husband. Thank you, Zhengyi," Wen whispered and looked skyward. In her mind she saw the outline of the great white dragon. Li Cheng bowed and left the old woman staring into the bright blue sky with a contented smile on her face. Xiao Qing knelt in the muddy road, crying. Cold night rain drenched her, hiding the salty tears rolling down her face. She pulled what remained of her torn blouse over an exposed shoulder and bundled her hurt in a fist at her chest. 3 attackers stalked a circle in the road around her. They laughed and taunted her with what they intended next. "You shouldn't have fought back, little girl," the largest of the bunch said. "We only wanted the wheat cakes." Another laughed and followed up his partner. "Now we're going to take something else." Qing took a deep breath and remembered her father's inspired words. "You are a fighter, Qing. Never stop fighting." The man to her left circled behind her, turned and rushed in. Qing fell to her left and scrambled for the side of the road. The man caught her left ankle and pulled her toward him. She kicked at the man's face with her free leg, landing a glancing blow along his neck. The other 2 grabbed her arms and hauled her to her feet. Qing twisted and tried to jab her fingers in their eyes, scratch them or kick them. The man holding her right arm delivered a hard punch to her midsection, which bent Qing forward. The man on her left turned and brought his left knee up to meet her face. Qing's legs went limp, and they pulled her to the rear of her small cart. They flopped her forward and pinned her arms. "Hold her!" the leader barked and kicked Qing's ankles aside. The black sky above the road burst into brilliant light. Several enormous lightning bolts flashed overhead. Deafening thunder blasted the 3 men, who covered their ears. Qing slipped to the ground. One of the men pointed to a hooded figure walking toward them along the road. The 3 outlaws forgot about the woman and turned their attention to new prey. "You've made a terrible mistake, stranger." "The mistake is yours," Zhengyi said, and slowly lowered his hood. The men laughed when they saw the black and red demonic mask. "Are you going to sing and dance for us, old woman?" 2 of the men approached Zhengyi, while the 3rd hung back, keeping Xiao Qing within arm's reach. "You," Zhengyi said, and pointed at the man nearest Qing. "You will die first." The leading 2 bandits looked back at their companion, laughed, and shook their heads. Zhengyi looked at the leader. "You will die last." The big man stepped toward Zhengyi, cocked his right arm, and swung a ferocious strike toward the mask. Zhengyi stepped to his right, easily avoiding the clumsy initial melee. The leader's companion landed a hard kick to Zhengyi's side, stopping his movement. Zhengyi spun a full circle to his right and cracked the man's temple with a spinning back fist. The outlaw staggered into the leader, who recovered from missing his target. Zhengyi launched off his left foot, used the stumbling man's back as an anchor, and slammed his right fist into the bridge of the leader's nose. Both men fell to the road. Zhengyi turned toward the other bandit, who did not approach. The man assumed a fighting stance, his eyes flicking from Zhengyi to his partners scrambling to stand. "I do not find pleasure in the death of the wicked," Zhengyi said. A swift wind blasted across the road, strong enough to force the raindrops to change direction. A moment later, the bandit guarding Xiao Qing vanished, his shriek quickly fading in the distance. Zhengyi turned to face the leader, his lone companion still in the road holding his temple. The man stared into the woods following his friend's terrifying screams. "What have you done?" "He was the first to die." The leader advanced again, more cautious of the man in the broken mask. The pair rounded each other until Zhengyi stood between the leader and the man on the ground. "I'm going to kill you," he growled. "Unlikely," Zhengyi answered and looked above the man. The bandit leader looked up in time to see an enormous white dragon drop from the night sky. After his screams dissipated into the night, Zhengyi turned to the final outlaw. The man lay on his side, knees pulled to his chest and his right hand pressing against his right temple. Zhengyi knelt. "Your shock and dizziness should abate by morning. Tell your compatriots that justice is coming for them also." Zhengyi walked to the woman huddled beside the cart. "There is no more danger," he said. "Who are you?" "I am justice." "Justice," Xiao Qing whispered. "Are you able to travel?" Qing nodded. "Climb aboard and continue on your way." "Thank you," Xiao Qing said, and clicked her ox forward. "You there!" the guard yelled. "What are you doing?" The hooded dark figure stopped in the road several paces from the guard hut. "Mr. Yazoo, get out here!" The guard lowered his pike and took 2 steps toward the stranger. "This better be important," a second man called from within their small hut. A large man emerged, still buckling his armor and adjusting his helmet. "What do you want here?" the original guard demanded. The cloaked man lowered his hands to his sides, palms open. "Word has come to me that you have an innocent boy in custody." "What business is it of yours?" Captain Yazoo asked. "It is my business to defend the innocent." "Who are you?" "I am Zhengyi." "Justice," the other guard whispered. Yazoo turned to his companion. "Do you know this man, Huan?" "Only in rumor, sir." "I don't know what you've heard, Mr. Zhengyi, but the person we have in our custody is guilty. He will get his chance to prove his innocence." Zhengyi stepped forward, and both guards flinched. "I have no quarrel with you, but you are mistaken. You will release the boy to his family." Yazoo laughed. "Why would I—" "We should do what he says," Huan blurted. Yazoo gave Huan a stern look. "If this is who I think it is, sir, we should do as he says." "Listen to your underling," Zhengyi said. "It will save us both a great deal of trouble." "We do not give up our prisoners in this village, especially on the word of a stranger who hides his face." "You want to see my face?" "Captain Yazoo, please," Huan pleaded. "Any time, Pan Shi," Li Cheng said in his mind. A rustling in the thick undergrowth beside the road drew the guard's attention. A dark form burst from the bushes and slid to Zhengyi's feet. A bound man lay moaning in the road. "This is the man you should have in custody. Release the boy." Yazoo straightened. "Huan," he calmly said, "rouse the magistrate. We will get to the bottom of this." The guard captain kept his eyes on the hooded figure. Huan hurriedly bowed and ran toward the village. A moment later, several men approached carrying torches and gleaming weapons. They stepped behind the guard captain, who held his spear toward the dark stranger. "Sir, this man claims we are holding the wrong man. He says he captured the actual criminal." A tall, thin man stepped forward.
"Who are you?"
"I am Justice," Zhengyi said, and lowered his hood, exposing the hideous red mask. The men recoiled at the horrible sight of the broken mask under the dark hood. Thunder rolled overhead in time with Zhengyi's words and movements, as though he controlled the storm brewing above them. "I am here to see justice done for the boy you have in your jail." The startled men looked up while the thunder intensified, following the dark stranger's volume. "Tell them," Zhengyi commanded, and tapped the crumpled man with his boot.
"I did it!"
a whimpering voice called. "I don't think they heard you." He delivered another kick to the man's backside.
"I did it!"
he cried.
"Bring that man here,"
the magistrate ordered his men. Two of the men took tentative steps forward, not wanting to get too close to the demon-looking man.
"Well, go on."
Zhengyi backed away from his prisoner. The guards dragged the man to the magistrate and stood him up.
"You confess?"
The man looked over his shoulder at the monstrous mask and the dark eyes behind it glaring at him. Lightning ripped across the sky, followed by a deafening thunderclap. The prisoner shook and cowered.
"I confess,"
he shouted. The magistrate considered the red death mask. Finally he said,
"Captain Yazoo, release the boy."
"Yes, magistrate." Yazoo signaled Huan, who rushed off.
"You play a deadly game, sir,"
the magistrate called to Zhengyi.
"You may find yourself in shackles before too long."
"It is the price of justice for a people that has none."
"The people have the Emperor's justice."
"I am well aware of the Emperor's justice." Huan appeared with a young man beside him.
"This man has confessed,"
the magistrate said.
"You are hereby released."
Huan removed the boy's shackles, and Captain Yazoo pushed him toward the dark stranger. The confused boy staggered toward Zhengyi. "Go home," Zhengyi softly said. "Your father is waiting for you." "Thank you," the young man said, bowed, and ran into the night.
"Don't come here again,"
the magistrate called. "I go where there is need of justice. If that means I come to this village again, then this is where I will come. Panshi, bring down the rain." Zhengyi raised his cloak's hood just before a pelting rain fell between the armed men and the dark stranger. When it cleared a moment later, the guards stood in the empty road. They looked at each other and at the magistrate.
"Captain Yazoo, take this man into custody. I have a hefty report to send to the governor."
Governor Han Yijun looked bored. He sat on a raised platform listening to a man talk about irrigation ditches or irritating itches. The governor did not pay the man much attention. After an entire day of petitioner following petitioner, Governor Han's mind wandered to more pleasant distractions like the roast duck he demanded for dinner or the alluring curves of the thin servant girl who would bring it to him. An awkward silence filled the room, pulling Yijun away from his daydreams. He straightened, cleared his throat, and looked at the man who wrung his hat in his hands. "I didn't hear that last part."
"Forgive me, sir," the man bowed. "About the river usage and building another ditch."
Han Yijun yawned and waved a hand. Yes, we must have such things." He looked to one of his hovering attendants. "Kung, see to it." The petitioner bowed.
"Thank you, Governor Han, thank you."
Han looked to an aide. "No more," he said and stood. A commotion in the corridor stopped him. Two guards dragged the prisoner into the receiving chamber and released him to crumple to the floor. Guard Captain Wu entered the receiving chamber, stepped around the guards, and bowed. Han regarded the moaning wretch and sat, more interested in this creature than any of the others who petitioned him today. Han looked at the guard captain. "And what is this, Captain Wu?" Wu snapped to attention. "Sir, a disturbing report came in from Zhengyi. I sent 2 men to investigate, and they returned with this man, a highwayman." "Why, bring him before me. The village leader can dispense justice in local matters." "Sir, the reports were of a vigilante,
A person taking the law into his own hands. I know what a He routed a significant group of bandits at their hideout, captured their leader, and delivered him to the village authorities. My men heard this one story and thought to bring him here.
Well, Han said and stood. We certainly can't have vigilantes flouting our authority, Captain.
No, sir.
Han waved a hand at the bandit. And what of this one's story? Wu signaled the guards, who drew the man to his knees.
Well, Han asked, what do you know of this vigilante?
The dirty man nodded several times before whispering,
Zhengyi. Speak up, man,
Han ordered.
The bandit spoke in choppy bursts. He came out of nowhere, moved in blackness, bested 15 or more.
Han paced and scowled at the man.
Captain Wu, can you make sense of this? Zhengyi!
The bandit shouted. Wu motioned for the guards to remove the prisoner, stepped before the governor and bowed.
Sir, it appears someone is moving through the countryside, going from village to village, delivering justice outside of the law.
Han Yijun frowned. Send word to every village. I want this man captured. We will bring justice to the land, not this Zhengyi. Captain Wu bowed and left to carry out the governor's orders. Epilogue. A single lantern burned in the corner of Cao Guo's office. The village leader sifted through unbelievable reports of a roaming vigilante provided by Governor Yijun's personal staff. According to witnesses, a masked outlaw calling himself Zhengyi appears in the night to thwart the activities of local authorities. Somehow, this person rounds up known criminals, delivers them to the local offices, and vanishes without a trace. This Zhengyi stops crimes in the act and saves the intended victims. Most concerning to Guo, the report of wrongly accused prisoners being set free. The village elder's attention wandered to a shadowed corner where long-forgotten memories danced at the periphery of his mind. Dangerous thoughts of betrayal ate at the back of his memory. He stroked his beard and focused on the top report from Sanji village. The people call him a hero, Guo thought. Dangerous indeed. The dark corner drew the old man's eyes again. Wrongly accused, being set free, he mused. He stood, walked to the door and signaled a guard. Go to my son's house and tell him I need to see him. The guard returned a pleading expression. Sir, the hour is late.
Do as I've ordered, Zan.
The guard bowed and left the village leader to his memories. A half-hour later, Cao Zimin joined his father in the office. You wanted me, father? Guo sat behind his desk and stroked his beard, his eyes fixed on the dark corner. We've never spoken of Li Cheng, the old man whispered. Zimin sat up, but did not respond. You two were friends, were you not? I knew him, but I don't think I would have called us. Cao Guo turned to face his son, the old man's expression finishing the sentence. Guo stared for several minutes, allowing the room to fill with his son's anxiety. Finally, Guo said, Something has bothered me all these years. Again, Zimin waited for his father to continue. We never found Lao Ping's attacker. It was Li Cheng, just as the guard said. Why would Cheng attack a sleeping guard after escaping the cage? Zimin's eyes looked from the right side of his father's desk to the other. What if Lao Ping woke at the sound of Cheng? You stole the fish. Don't lie to me, Guo demanded, and slammed his fist on the desk. Zimin answered with silence and fear on his face. Guo nodded, recognition slipping the pieces into place within his mind. And you lied about Li Cheng? Zimin looked at the floor. And you just lied to me about Cheng attacking Lao Ping. I thought Li Cheng would run and never come back. Cao Guo shook his head. You have put me in a very difficult position. Father, I sentenced an innocent man. Cao Guo's gaze returned to the dark corner, and memories of Li Cheng's punishment surfaced. He is most likely dead by now. What's done is done. Guo slid the stack of papers toward his son. Zimin sat again and read through the reports. If this Zhengyi character comes to Xiangung, I might not be able to protect us. How could he ever know what happened here? Guo ignored the question. The governor is sending garrisons of men to hunt this man down. We can only hope they capture him before he somehow learns of your treachery. Zumin shifted uneasily at the word. He set the reports back on his father's desk, stood, and walked to the office door. "Zumin," Guo called after him. Cao Zumin stopped at the door, but did not turn back to his father. "What else have you lied to me about?" Zumin left without answering. The end. We hope you enjoyed The Rise of Zhengyi by E.G.Rowley, Book 1 in the Brotherhood of Talons saga. The adventure will continue in Book 2, The Exiled Prince. This audiobook was produced by Jumpmaster Press and read by the author. Copyright 2023, all rights reserved. No portion of this performance may be transmitted or rebroadcast without prior written approval of the copyright owner. Explore the entire catalog of Jumpmaster Press titles at www.jumpmasterpress.com and wherever fine books are sold.